implementation meeting. My name is Katarina Argan and I am the head of Human Rights Department at ODIHR. Before we start perhaps talking about the session, a couple of technical information. I would like to kindly remind the participants that the speaker list is behind me, and if you would like to take the floor, please make sure that you sign up for the speakers list. Another thing that I would kindly ask you to remember is that if you have written statements, to submit them to the documentation center so that we can provide them to our interpreters, and they will not be distributed without your consent outside of to external audience. So now, without further ado, we can start this session. We'll continue talking about fundamental freedoms, and in particular topics that are very close to my heart personally and also at the core of the work of ODIHR and its Human Rights Department. We will be talking about the connection between the freedom of peaceful assembly and association, the work of national human rights institutions and civil society, and in this context also the human rights defenders, and the significance of human rights education. We will look at linkages, we will look at good practices, and we will also look at challenges. And we at ODIHR have been following developments across the OSCE area, and we note several good practices and improvements for the work of NHRIs, for the work of human rights defenders, and in the field of human rights education. We have produced a number of tools and guidelines on these topics that I'm sure you are familiar with, and they are also available for participants outside of the plenary room. But we also see with growing concern that the space for civil society and human rights defenders is shrinking in many OSCE participating states through a number of restrictive measures, including in legislation. We would like to see a bigger possibility for independent and fully resourced work of national human rights institutions. And we would very much welcome greater opportunities for systematic, institutionalized human rights education that's mainstreamed in general education, because educating young people on human rights is a cornerstone of democratic, human rights-based and stable societies. We today have two speakers, and I have an honor to introduce the first of our introducers, Dr. Anja Bienert, who has cooperated with ODIHR for many years as a member of our panel of experts on freedom of peaceful assemblies. Dr. Bienert has many years of work experience in the area of humanitarian assistance and security issues in various countries affected by non-international armed conflicts and other situations of violence. As an expert for the European Commission's Humanitarian Office, she worked in Mali and Burundi, and as a delegate of the International Committee of the Red Cross in Peru, Myanmar, South Sudan, and Zimbabwe. From 2008 to 2011, Dr. Bienert acted as a Geneva-based ICRC advisor for headquarters and delegations worldwide on issues related to police and security forces. Since March 2011, she is in charge of the Police and Human Rights Program of the Dutch section of Amnesty International. And in this capacity, she is providing guidance, advice, and training within Amnesty International on policing issues. Dr. Bienert regularly participates in international conferences and peer reviews for the United Nations, the Fundamental Rights Agency, and for us, related to human rights and policing, and is the author of several publications on these issues. Dr. Bienert, please take the floor.
Okay. Good morning. Thank you very much for inviting me to this important meeting. I'm very pleased to be here with you all and to discuss the interesting topic of right to freedom of peaceful assembly. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to be with you here. The right to freedom of peaceful assembly is an essential right for human rights defenders to make their voices heard. And it is in the interest of them that their messages are heard when they take to the streets and they want to raise their voices. However, what we see, what too often makes the headlines, is not actually the message of the assembly, it's when there is violence. When it ends up in casualties and destruction of property, when police use force, and this is what makes the headlines and dilutes to some extent the message what human rights defenders want to convey when they go to the streets. And in the end, it may even lead to people not daring to go out to the streets anymore because they are afraid of the consequences they see in the streets. The causes for this type of situations are, of course, different from one context to the other, from one assembly to the others. And, of course, one element that we all know is that where police is used as an arm or a tool of the state to repress and to quell opposition and protest, that is a very difficult and challenging situation for human rights defenders. And actually here we are not talking anymore about a problem on the policing of assemblies and the freedom of peaceful assembly, but we are talking about a much more fundamental problem. So this is not my topic actually today. It's all the other situations where very unnecessarily as public assemblies end up in violence. And there can be so many different reasons for this. One can be that the topic of the protest is very contentious and that people are facing violent counter-protesters. Other situations can be that there are a smaller group of people engaging in violence during a protest. And often, and unfortunately still too often, it's also quite an problematic policing approach with a sort of a zero-tolerance approach, an approach that sees demonstrators rather as annoyance, a group of troublemakers. This can lead to a situation of escalation and tension and increased tension, and then ends up in the violence I was talking at the beginning. What our work within the Police and Human Rights Program tries to look at is that how can this be prevented? And fortunately, we were able to find a lot of situations where actually a totally different approach from both sides, from those who want to take their voices to the streets and the police, try to make sure that an assembly stays peaceful. They talk to each other before an assembly. They talk to each other about possible problems, about what can be done, what cannot be done. Especially since the last 2 decades, there are very interesting experiences about how problems can actually be prevented and make sure that human rights defenders are able to bring their message to the streets. So this is a very difficult process, and I talked both to civil society and to police officers, and the prejudices and perceptions are sometimes very difficult, and police perceiving demonstrators only as a group of possible troublemakers, and human rights defenders perceiving people in uniform per se as the bad guys. But there are experiences where these prejudices were able to be overcome, and where actually it is possible to realize a peaceful assembly. But this requires from the onset by the police a totally different approach. Too often we see within police looking at assemblies only with the perspective of, oh, there will be trouble, and we might have the need to resort to the use of force. When you look at manuals from police, 80% very often is dedicated only as means of use of force and not at the possibility to facilitate an assembly. From Amnesty International, we have recently produced a publication which are guidelines for the implementation of the UN Basic Principles on the Use of Force in Firearms, and we have a chapter on use of force in public assemblies. But actually the key message of that publication is that assemblies should be policed in a way, in an approach that seeks to facilitate and to encourage dialogue, and not from the onset looking at option for the use of force. So we hope that law enforcement authorities around the world will look at that particular chapter when policing assemblies. When I was talking about the positive examples that we have met, that we have found, and how useful dialogue can be, I just would like to highlight a few ones. During a very contentious and in the past often violent assembly, police and organizers discussed before and exchanged phone numbers, and at a certain moment there was a heavy police movement, and there were immediately rumors that police were preparing for sort of the battle. But in the end, there was a phone call between organizers and police said, no, sorry, it's just a change of shift. We are just moving people, it's nothing about battle. And with these small things, major problems and rumors were prevented. In Amsterdam, Amnesty International organized an important wanted to organize a demonstration during a visit of a head of state. But what was the problem is that the police wouldn't allow demonstrators close to the state visit. What was then allowed was that the entire city of Amsterdam was decorated with human rights messages, so that there was not the security threat to the head of state, but that the human rights message could be conveyed. So these are just two examples to show how it is possible that human rights defenders and police act together for the same purpose on ensuring the enjoyment of the right to freedom of peaceful assemblies. So we have also the topic of human rights education here today, and I think this is an important element on human rights education for human rights defenders, actually, to better understand how police is supposed to police assemblies and how then to engage in dialogue with them and to foresee problems and to anticipate problems and to try to seek solutions prior to an assembly already. Then this is something that can help, that human rights defenders can actually bring their voices to the streets. I have also been asked very often how human rights education of police can contribute to that endeavor. And I think, of course, police officers and law enforcement officials should know very much about their duty to facilitate assemblies and how they can do that. However, I think much more important for police in assemblies are the orders given, the training and the skills and the command and control. We try to highlight that in our publication I was mentioning already, and we hope that police will implement the recommendations that we have formulated in terms of command and control. But that does not mean that police officers would not need human rights education, which of course is an essential message that the command leadership should convey to their law enforcement officials. Just to conclude on that, it is so sad to see how many assemblies end up in violence. And it's so good to see how many assemblies do not end up in violence. And these examples for us are those who should call on all authorities in all countries to try to achieve this as well, and to change from a different approach in policing that is about the facilitation and the dialogue, and not about contemplating the use of force in the first place. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bienert. Before we introduce the second introducer, I would like to just mention that there has been a change in our introducers list because, unfortunately, our guest invited for this session had to cancel at the last moment, but we are honored and happy to welcome in the role of the introducer, Mr. Michael Forst, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders, and with whom ODIHR cooperates very closely, not least in the framework of the Inter-Mechanism for the Protection of Human Rights Defenders. Mr. Forst was appointed to this post by the President of the Human Rights Council in June 2014. He graduated from the French National School of Public Health and from the Universities of Paris and Strasbourg. He has worked extensively in the field of human rights, including human rights defenders, the rights of children with disabilities, extreme poverty, and the elderly. From 2008 to 2013, Mr. Forst was the UN independent expert on the situation of human rights in Haiti. And from 2012 to 2013, he was chair of the Coordination Committee of the Special Procedures of the UN Human Rights Council. He has held a number of leading positions within the field of human rights since 1989, including the French National Consultative Commission on Human Rights, UNESCO, the First World Summit on Human Rights Defenders, and Amnesty International in France. He is also a former member of the board of the International Service for Human Rights in Geneva and a founding member of Frontline Defenders in Dublin. Mr. Forst, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll speak in French.
Madam Chair, ladies and gentlemen delegates, I would like to start by thanking you for this invitation to share some recent experiences that I've had in the field of protecting human rights based on meetings that I've had with human rights defenders in the OSCE region. As has been mentioned, about a year ago, I was appointed to a very specific mission, special rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders in the world, with a very clear mandate to collect information, to analyze information, and then to react to it, information concerning the situation of human rights defenders in the world. For about 15 years ago, in fact more than that, the United Nations adopted a declaration on human rights defenders, and in these meetings of the OSCE, I'm often asked what a human rights defender is. How do you define such a defender? And maybe that's a discussion that should be reopened. I mean, it's a difficult discussion, but the answer is quite simple, and it's to be found in this UN declaration, which defines such individuals as anyone who individually or as a group works to promote or protect human rights at the local, national, or international level. So human rights defenders can be members of civil society, of course, lawyers, for instance, journalists, online bloggers, human rights militants or women's rights militants, students, ecologists, but they can also be diplomats, police officers, or whistleblowers such as very recently John Snowden. So they're just ordinary men and women who believe in the universality of human rights and who act to defend them. Now, we all know that human rights defenders play a key role in the safeguarding of democracy, and they work to make sure that democracy remains open, pluralist, and participatory. Now, the safety and the security of human rights defenders in the region of the OSCE is of grave concern, and in order to better understand their situation, I organized 2 regional consultations with defenders in the region, the first one in Tbilisi in November of last year, and the second in Florence in June of this year. Now, what I've heard from them about the situation of human rights defenders in the region is that there has been a very worrisome increase in restrictions imposed on the work of human rights defenders and a narrowing of the public space available to them. Now, in this context, we have seen some growing restrictions on civil society activists, and I'll mention a few: refusals to register NGOs, limitations on what they can do, how they can act, unacceptable requirements when it comes to reporting and accounting verification or auditing, as well as stigmatization of human rights defenders by the media controlled by the state. And this can be put in parallel with a growing trend that is also of grave concern that one observes in a number of OSCE states, with a narrowing of the legislative framework that covers human rights activities, often on the pretext of measures to protect and combat terrorism. We've seen such changes in Spain, in France, in Italy, and other countries, and we have also witnessed a growing use of security cooperation frameworks such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization to limit the space available to civil society. On a daily basis, I receive appeals from civil society that reflects this difficult situation in the region, and I would invite you to read the many examples of such cases in my annual report on communications to the Council of Human Rights of the United Nations. It was submitted in March of this year. In that report, you will find cases of systematic targeting of defenders and militants from civil society in Azerbaijan, including Anar Mammadli, Rasul Jafarov, Intigam Aliyev, Leila and Arif Yunus, and Kajia Ismailova. The defenders in the OSCE region sometimes pay a very high price for their commitment. That's true of Fakhreddin Tiliev, who was found guilty on false charges and tortured in Uzbekistan. And then there's the emblematic case of Askarov, who is currently in prison for life in the Kyrgyz Republic for his peaceful and legitimate activities. Ladies and gentlemen, judicial and administrative harassment is being used more and more frequently to intimidate and persecute human rights defenders. That's the case, for instance, of Elena Tonkacheva, who was expelled from Belarus in February of this year after having lived and worked there on issues of human rights for decades. Some human rights defenders have found refuge from torture and threats, death threats, in the United Kingdom, in Sweden, in Norway, but unfortunately they have been confronted there with threats of deportation, and that's a clear violation of the principle of non-refoulement. Other examples of targeting of human rights defenders are mentioned in my report: a prohibition to travel, financial restrictions, intimidation, harassment of defenders and their families, including death threats, and unfortunately there are more and more cases of intense physical and electronic surveillance by the bodies of the state in order to obtain information about the lives of these individuals. So this is just a brief review of the pressures and the threats to which human rights defenders are confronted in the region. Now the question for us is, what can we do to reverse this regressive trend of the human dimension in the region? Well, allow me to conclude my statement by making a few quick suggestions as to how this discussion can most usefully be continued. First of all, it must be recalled unflaggingly that in accordance with international law, the primary responsibility to protect human rights defenders lies with states, and that is something that is significant for all delegations around this table. You all have that responsibility as representatives of governments. The governments of the region must therefore recognize their obligation to respect and to avoid any violation of the rights of human rights defenders. They must protect and defend these militants against abuses by third parties. And second, I would urgently request of all participating states that they start to put into practice the guidelines of the OSCE on the protection of human rights defenders. Unfortunately, that is not the case in all of the states at the present time. Third, governments must put in place national human rights institutions that are independent and fully in line with the Paris principles, because they are extremely valuable partners for the implementation of the OSCE guidelines. And finally, in closing, I cannot stress too much the importance for your organization of establishing regional and national protection platforms with networks to support the works and the lives of human rights defenders. And these support networks can provide a platform for the elaboration of strategies, documentation of rights violations, improving the safety and the security of defenders and preventing threats against them. With such support from their peers, I am convinced that will allow defenders in the region to be more independent and safer. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Forst. I take note of you highlighting the critical role of human rights defenders and the ongoing challenges they face in the changing security architecture across the OSCE and within the increasingly restrictive legislative framework in some participating states. And as we look back at the implementation of OSCE commitments, I think it is important to take a critical look and think how we can work together, work better to ensure protection of human rights defenders. I also take the point made by the previous introducer about the key importance of the freedom of peaceful assemblies for the uninhibited, free and safe work of human rights defenders. I think these are very important points that we should keep in mind in today's discussions. We have now 30, I think, 6 speakers signed up for the list. With this, I would like to mention that the speaking time will be limited to 3 minutes. And I would ask each speaker to first introduce themselves briefly with the name and organization or delegation they represent. The first speaker on the list is Human Rights Without Frontiers, followed by the delegation of the United Kingdom on behalf of the European Union. Human Rights Without Frontiers, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I will address the issue of freedom of assembly and demonstration in Armenia. On the last day of January of this year, the civic movement, Centennial Without This Regime, organized a peaceful motorcade to Artsakh on the model of the Automaidan in Kiev to raise awareness among the citizens about corruption and lack of justice in Armenia. The police, including special forces units armed with sniper rifles and automatic weapons, blocked the motorcade demonstration on the highway to Berdzor and then brutally attacked the participants and their vehicles. Despite the fact that they obeyed the order of the police to turn back, they were attacked as they were trying to leave. Several of the participants were brutally beaten and had to be hospitalized. As a result of this violent attack, 20 vehicles were damaged, 3 professional cameras were seized from the journalists, and numerous smartphones were violently taken from the participants. The total amount of the damage was estimated by the participants around $40,000. On YouTube, there are several videos confirming the police violence and the extent of the damages. The Centennial Without This Regime movement and the founding parliament, a civil initiative, were the driving forces of the socio-political opposition to the president behind the demonstrations. Their events were peaceful and remained within the limits of as their leaders insisted in a press release. Another demonstration took place in April. At that time, Yerevan municipality had authorized a series of rallies that were to start on the 24th of April, but in the meantime, a crackdown on the 2 organizing movements was decided on the basis of suspicions of wrongdoings. Another demonstration, maybe better known because it was mentioned on television around Europe, is the protest about the electricity rise in June. There again, there were police violence. Some 4,000 to 5,000 people participated in that demonstration and walked towards the parliament and the president's office when the police blocked the street, and then the sit-in strike began right in the middle of it. During the night, the police used water cannons to disperse those remaining. On the next day, the police also beat a number of protesters. About a dozen of them required intensive care. 237 demonstrators, as well as journalists, were arrested and released on the same or next day. Overall, 600, 700 police officers participated in the operation. We put recommendations, but they can be found on the website of the OSCE. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. The next speaker on the list is the delegation of the United Kingdom on behalf of the European Union, followed by the Analytical Center on Globalization and Regional Cooperation. United Kingdom, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning. The following EU statement is also on behalf of the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Norway, Ukraine, Andorra and San Marino. The European Union attaches a high priority to the promotion and protection of the fundamental freedoms of peaceful assembly and association. They are intrinsic to any democratic society and facilitate the enjoyment of other rights, including that of freedom of expression. They are also essential prerequisites for the functioning of an independent civil society. National human rights institutions and civil society can often form a bridge between the rights of the citizen and the responsibilities of the states, and play an essential role in promoting and protecting human rights. Our main recommendations to participating states relating to this session are: 1. Avoid the excessive use of force in the policing of demonstrations and assemblies. 2. Adopt laws and policies that clearly establish a presumption in favour of holding assemblies. 3. In accordance with OSCE commitments, permit organisations and individuals associated with them to seek, receive, manage and administer financial support from domestic, foreign and international entities without undue restrictions. 4. Allow organisations the freedom to maintain contacts and cooperate with members of organisations within and outside the countries where they are based, as well as with foreign governments and international organisations. 5. Encourage regular dialogue with civil society, both at a national level and at the OSCE. 6. Take advantage of tools such as the ODIHR Venice Commission guidelines on freedom of peaceful assembly and freedom of association. And 7. Extend invitations to ODIHR as part of their cycle of assembly monitoring in selected participating states. Moderator, the freedoms of peaceful assembly and association are increasingly being limited and restricted in the OSCE region. This trend has a negative impact on the enjoyment of other human rights, and it is contributing to shrinking of space for independent civil society. The right of freedom of association continues to be challenged in the Russian Federation and some other OSCE countries by the consideration and enactment of laws that restrict access to foreign funding for NGOs and label them as foreign agents. Such legislation runs counter to international standards and OSCE commitments and has a chilling effect on civil society. The Russian Federation's so-called undesirable foreign non-governmental organizations law is a further troubling step in a series of restrictions on civil society, independent media and political opposition. In relation to freedom of peaceful assembly, we have seen troubling allegations of excessive use of force in the policing of demonstrations, including in relation to gay pride marches in a number of OSCE countries. We call for such allegations to be impartially and promptly investigated and for appropriate action to be taken against anyone found responsible. I'm aware of the time, so I'll just finish briefly. Civil society has not only faced restrictions within participating states. At the OSCE level, efforts to recognise and strengthen the valuable role of civil society has been obstructed by a small number of participating states. This is not the sort of message we should be sending to our civil society partners, whose contribution we believe greatly enhances the work of the OSCE. In conclusion, we commend the Serbian chairmanship for the focus and they have given to the freedom of assembly and freedom of peaceful assembly and association this year. The SHDM in April provided evidence as to why strengthened commitments in this area are needed, and we are encouraged that the chairmanship intends to pursue ministerial deliverables to make this happen. We will circulate a full version of this statement. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. The next on the speaker list is the Analytical Center on Globalization and Regional Cooperation, followed by the delegation of the United States of America. The Analytical Center, the floor is yours.
Grigorian Stepan, я из Армении.
Thank you very much. I'm from Armenia. I'd like to draw attention to the fact that there are different ways of violating human rights and fundamental freedoms. But from our point of view, for the countries of the Eastern Partnership, what is extremely important is to have this cooperation between the EU and our countries as a way of creating a platform for protecting human rights defenders. Now, at the Riga Civil Society Forum in May of this year, we civil society activists adopted a declaration in which we said that in those countries, Belarus, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, that didn't sign the agreement, there should continue to be this cooperation, because this can have a very positive impact on the situation of human rights. And let me just say a few words about the situation in Belarus. We drew attention to the fact that at the summit in Riga the summit of heads of state of the countries of the Eastern Partnership and the EU, some positive statements were made about dialogue between Belarus and the EU on human rights dialogue. And we connect this in particular with the fact that some politicians were freed from prisons. That was a positive message. And here I would like to appeal to Armenia. Armenia has not signed the association agreement. It's become a member of the so-called Euro-Asian Economic Union. And we don't really have a common Armenia-EU agenda. And we're very concerned by that because this lack of cooperation between Armenia and the EU can be very dangerous for human rights in Armenia. There is a growing trend of putting pressure on demonstrators. There have been, in certain demonstrations, Electric Yerevan, for instance, there has been a lot of tension between the police forces and the demonstrators, and we had to make a lot of efforts to make sure that violence would not be used a second time. So cooperation with the EU is a very good instrument to limit the appetite for exercising power by our authorities, and we think that that is a good way to sort of overcome the negative balance. Thank you.
We will now give the floor to the delegation of the United States of America, followed by Azerbaijan Institute for Democracy and Human Rights. United States, the floor is yours.
Good morning, Rob Bershinsky, representing the United States of America. Given time constraints, we'll circulate our full remarks in written form following the session. The freedom of peaceful assembly and association is a cornerstone of democracy, yet during the last year, Russia accelerated its attack on the right to freedom of association and peaceful assembly. Russia has justified arbitrary inspections of NGOs and selectively warned, listed, and prosecuted specific groups under its so-called foreign agents law. There are now 92 organizations on Russia's foreign agents list, and 12 have been required to identify their media as originating with a foreign agent. In July, the Ministry of Justice threatened some organizations with liquidation for failure to do so. Additionally, a new law on undesirable foreign organizations adopted in May makes Russian NGOs deemed to be cooperating with such organizations vulnerable to criminal penalties. The government of Azerbaijan continues to constrict the space for civil society. The government targeted many civil society groups that receive international funding. As a result, several organizations have ceased their operations inside Azerbaijan. In Turkmenistan, NGOs must register all foreign funding and grants, and these must be re-registered annually. The process is unclear and slow, and all NGO activities must be in line with the government work plan. In Kyrgyzstan, a proposed anti-LGBT propaganda law seeks to criminalize all actions that propagate, quote, a positive attitude towards non-traditional sexual relations, unquote, which could include the exercise of freedom of peaceful assembly. A foreign agents law, which passed its first reading in June, seeks to require anyone receiving foreign funding to register and provides authorities sweeping monitoring authority. A June presidential decree requires all NGOs and INGOs registered in Uzbekistan to provide the government with written notification of their activities. NGOs must seek written approval from the government to hold any meetings with foreign entities. In Tajikistan, the right to freedom of association and peaceful assembly remains seriously restricted, contrary to Tajikistan's own constitution. The government of Kazakhstan's new trade union law requires all unions to affiliate with an official national confederation in order to register and be authorized to operate. In Belarus, the Ministry of Justice denied the Belarusian Christian Democracy Party's application for registration in July for the 5th time. A significant government crackdown on freedom of NGOs to operate in Hungary began in 2014 and continues to the present day. Finally, combined Russian-backed separatists in Donetsk and Luhansk Oblasts and occupation authorities in Crimea use widespread harassment and intimidation to suppress the ability of individuals to exercise their right to freely assemble unless the purpose of assembly is acceptable to those in power. Tatars and pro-Ukrainian activists in Crimea have been especially hard hit. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The Azerbaijan Institute for Democracy and Human Rights will now take the floor, followed by the civil campaign European Belarus.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am Ahmad Shahidov, human rights defender from Azerbaijan. The issues that we discussed today is a milestone of fundamental freedoms. As a human rights advocate, I always worked in sake of freedom of assembly and association. Due to the wars and conflicts that we have today, ensuring these rights falls under question. My country also has these problems as well. I would like to inform you on one of these problems. In fact, it's not appropriate to criticize Azerbaijan government on this issue because it was official Baku which mostly suffered from this matter. This person, these are photos of Dilgan Askarov and Shahbaz Guliyev, Azerbaijani hostages. They are originally from Kalbajar district, which is currently under the occupation of Armenian armed forces. It's already 1 year that they have been kept hostage by Armenian side and jailed in Nagorno-Karabakh. It may seem strange to you, but they didn't nothing wrong, didn't violate border regulation of any country, however, they are still kept hostage in Armenia. Please look to these photos attentively, they are civilians. Now look to these photos taken during their so-called trial. Armenian side treats with them as terrorists and subjects them to torture. I have been at the International Committee of the Red Cross in Switzerland, and even they admitted that Armenian side is not constructive on release of these civilian people. It means the international community is weak on this issue. Armenian representative here sends out peace-building message here and calls everyone to dialogue. Is that your understanding on peace and dialogue? I'm addressing to Daniel Barry, US ambassador, and David Kramer, another US representatives here. You always criticize Azerbaijan for jailed journalists. I do appreciate this invitation of yours, and I am in favor of release of jailed journalists and human rights defenders in Azerbaijan. I always follow you on social media, read all your statements and speech. You have never talked about Azerbaijan hostage. You have never talked about 1 million Azerbaijan refugees. You have never talked about territorial integrity of Azerbaijan. Why? Is that the way how you support human rights in Azerbaijan? Can you turn to the Armenian representative who is sitting next to you and ask about Azeri hostages? Ask them why they took Azerbaijani hostages. You cannot. Maybe you are not willing. No problem. I will ask in your place why Armenia doesn't release these civilian people. Why official Yerevan damaged peace talks. I would like to address all attendees here. We have thousands of people in Azerbaijan whose rights are violated nowadays, but you only talk about several people. It's that what human democracy and objectivity. I am very surprised of discussions, and I ask you to be a little brief, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We will now ask to take the floor the Civil Campaign European Belarus, followed by the delegation of the Russian Federation, European Belarus.
My name is Bondarenko. I'm from the Civil Campaign. We're in Warsaw, and the Polish media have said that last year the capital of Poland had more than 700 demonstrations and protests. 600 kilometers away in Minsk over the past year, there has hardly been a single demonstration that was allowed by the authorities. Is Belarus some sort of paradise? Well, probably not. What the big problem that we have in Belarus society is the falsification, electoral fraud, the establishment of new Russian bases in the country, the decrease of industrial production in Minsk, for example, by 30%. Unemployment benefit in Belarus is approximately the equivalent of $15 a month. Over the past few years, the devaluation of the Belarus ruble, it's fallen sixfold. And the civil opposition, civil rights activists have to conduct unauthorized protest. We're calling for the release of political detainees in Belarus, and yesterday, a recent released political prisoner was fined for holding a so-called unauthorized picket during the presidential campaign in Belarus. So if he is recognized as guilty of this by law, he can be sent back to jail. The Belarus authorities have kept power through repression for many years, and the Soviet Union was considered as a totalitarian state, but present Belarus is an authoritarian state. But the number of police in Belarus compared to the Soviet times is per 100,000 of population is 7 times higher. So in other words, this country is a police state, which for many years was dominated by the Soviet Union. However, if there's no protest, the problem is simply pushed under the carpet, and sooner or later, the people rise against dictatorship, and you have a social explosion. And in that situation, one can forecast that the European Union may well be faced with another flow of refugees, tens of thousands. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next on the speakers list is the delegation of the Russian Federation, followed by the Turkmen community in Norway. Russian Federation, the floor is yours.
Dear colleagues, our Western partners are demonstrating complete misunderstanding of the political processes underway in Russia. The persistent attempts to identify individual federal laws as an attempt to muzzle civil society don't stand up to criticism. The development of Russian legislation is aimed at improving the transparency of the work of NGOs and improving their effectiveness in dealing with important socio-political issues. And all branches of power and civil society are involved in this. And those who don't understand this process could pay attention perhaps to the activities of the President's Council on the Development of Civil Society and human rights, and also various federal and regional ombudsmen. Our partners, with enviable tenacity, are pretending that what is being done in Russia is somehow beyond the pale. But in any country, attempts to influence from the outside an internal political process is subject to legal attention, and that's quite natural. I would like to remind you that there are provisions in American legislation that provide for administrative and criminal liability for destructive activities against the government of the U.S. that can include 20 years of deprivation of liberty. And since in American law there is criminal liability for legal persons, it is possible to apply the standards of the U.S. Code to foreign non-commercial organizations. And since the United States acts in an extraterritorial way when it comes to legal issues, that can mean that non-commercial organizations that have no presence on the territory are subject to this liability. The FARA law, Foreign Agents Registration Act, adopted in 1938, not only limits lobbying by foreign interests, but in fact controls them very closely. And in accordance with this law, any individuals who represent the interests of foreign principals, including foreign governments at any level, political parties, and also legal and physical persons, must report to the Ministry of Justice of the United States. And for not following the provisions of FARA, one can pay very large fines or even be imprisoned for up to 5 years. The work of such organizations, if this is a threat to security, they can actually go to prison. And this is true of the Great Britain, in France. Any group that has, and I quote, the intention of undermining the integrity of a state territory or the republican form of government can be closed down, quite simply. And such organizations cannot be registered. And there are such limitations in many other countries, including Belgium, Germany, Finland, and the Czech Republic. Dear colleagues, unfortunately, not all states parties of the OSCE have set up NPRIs that are in line with the Paris principles, and yet those countries, in a patronizing way, point their finger at others who are supposedly not effective. But the Russian Federation pays a lot of attention to human rights defense. We not only have a human rights ombudsman who deals with the entire spectrum of human rights issues and has regional branches, but we also have a sectoral ombudsman on the rights of the child and on the rights of entrepreneurs. And there are various other instruments to protect human rights and develop a civil society, reporting in particular to the President and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation. Thank you for your attention.
Speakers list is the Turkmen community in Norway, followed by Turkmenistan Helsinki Foundation for Human Rights. Turkmen community in Norway.
I'm a former MP of Turkmenistan, a dissident, and I now live in Norway. Ladies and gentlemen, Turkmenistan at present is a totalitarian state. All organizations are dependent on the state. When Turkmenistan became a member of the UN and the OSCE, and it undertook various obligations and was strongly criticized, and the dictatorial regime, for example, a special organization was set up. Young people and all of these NGOs were fully controlled by the government, the parliament, and different organizations were set up as an official council, and this dictatorship continues to exist. The so-called Institute for Human Rights was established by the authorities and reports directly to the president. So this is simply a lightning conductor, and this institute has no right whatsoever to criticize or get involved in security matters. We all this institute does is to distract the attention of the international organizations and engage in empty discussions. It deals with endless improvement in legislation, and the actual specific result is zero. And according to eyewitness accounts, the media, mass media of Turkmenistan are simply engaged in the personality cult of the president. There's not a single newspaper that reports on human rights violations in Turkmenistan, violation of freedom of movement, association, and everything is simply geared to singing the praise of the leader. In 2010, against this backdrop of a single-party state, the president made a token gesture in response to Western criticism and stated that a new political party, in accordance with our constitution, may now be established. It's no secret that the population of Turkmenistan has been turned into zombies. Human rights activists are not allowed to take part in elections. And the president did not allow opposition leaders who'd been living in exile to come back to the country. And Berdimuhamedov stated that he intended to set up a second party, and the leader of this party was a close associate of the president. And he called upon the leader of the Union of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs, and the party was set up in this way. And I'm not joking, this is quite serious. And we have little time, says the, could you please finish, says the moderator. So all this organization is simply a puppet organization. There is no hint of dissent or opposition activity. Thank you.
I would like to give the floor to the Turkmenistan Helsinki Foundation for Human Rights, followed by Western Thrace Minority University Graduates Association, the Turkmenistan Helsinki Foundation.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. My colleague has spoken in detail to the rights and freedoms available to residents of Turkmenistan, but I'd like to speak to something a bit different. Thank you very much to the American delegation, and in particular the ambassador, for having worked so hard to make sure that the delegation of Turkmenistan would be present here and would hear out what we, the Turkmens, have to say. But unfortunately, today they have left us. I tried to meet with them 2 days ago and to discuss all of these very painful issues with them, but unfortunately there was no agreement on the other side to discuss these issues. I also turned to the delegation of the Russian Federation, asking them to help me to engage in this dialogue, but that was also rejected. So the Turkmenistan delegation doesn't want to talk about these issues at all. They're not interested in NHRIs or anything of that ilk. Now, my colleague spoke yesterday and criticized some European countries, but we would like to meet with representatives of the EU and to discuss these issues in some greater detail and at some greater depth, to present the situation in Turkmenistan to them, because at the present time the EU is engaged in dialogue with Turkmenistan, and we'd like to see a human rights dimension included in that. And let me say a specific word about Bulgaria. Unfortunately, in Bulgaria, some of the laws are still on the books date back from the Soviet period. There was an agreement signed in 1975 about family and civil rights and issues. Now, Bulgaria considers all citizens of the Soviet Union to continue to be citizens of the Soviet Union, a non-existent state. Now, my statement will be available on the site of the conference. There is a discussion here about the rights of individuals with dual citizenship, people who have Turkmenistan citizenship, and also Russian or American, and it's all in the paper. Thank you.
The Western Thrace Minority University Graduates Association, followed by the Freedom House.
Good morning. My name is Sinan Kavaz. I'm an attorney at law representing the Western Thrace Minority University Graduates Association. Distinguished delegates, Western Thrace Minority University Graduates Association calls upon the Greek state to respect and implement the provisions of the international human rights instruments in which the freedom of assembly and association is safeguarded, to ensure that the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and association is enjoyed by the whole society, either individually or as a group, without discrimination and restriction on the basis of ethnic or social origin, to repeal any restrictions on the right to freedom of association discriminating against Turkish minority of Western Thrace, to recognize and take positive measures to implement the decisions of the European Court of Human Rights, to respect the Turkish minority's self-identification and repeal its decision regarding the banning of Turkish associations, to facilitate dialogue with the Turkish minority's decision-making bodies on the related issues to build trust towards the authorities. Madam Moderator, the right to freedom of association is a basic fundamental human right that is stipulated by most of the fundamental human rights instruments. However, as of 2015, the Turkish minority of Western Thrace, the only officially recognized minority in Greece, is not allowed to use the word Turk or Turkish in the titles of associations, since these words constitute a threat to a public order and territorial integrity. 3 associations of the Turkish minority of Western Thrace were banned since they have the word Turk or Turkish in their titles. Also, the state authorities do not let the Turkish minority members establish new associations with ethnic Turkish names. In 3 cases, the European Court of Human Rights decided that Greece violated the right to freedom of assembly and association, namely Turkey, Enosi Xanthis and others versus Greece, Emin and others versus Greece, Bekir Usta and others versus Greece. After the European Court of Human Rights decisions in favor of the minority associations, the Greek officials started to say that we strive for the solution of the problem as a delaying tactic just to gain time and keep the issue pending. It is clear that Greece has no intention to make legal arrangements for the implementation of the European Court of Human Rights decisions. As the Greek authorities insistently keep on repeating at various national and international fora that they are working on new regulations for amending the Greek domestic law, so as to cease contradicting with the European Court of Human Rights jurisprudence. However, no step has been taken for years to repeal the unlawful and unacceptable implementations towards the Turkish minority of Western Thrace. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I will ask now the Freedom House to take the floor, followed by the Center for Economic and Social Development. Freedom House.
House would like to draw special attention today to Belarus as it stands on the eve of presidential elections. The release of the 6 political prisoners is, of course, a welcome development, but it should not be viewed as a radical change of the Belarusian government's attitude towards the fundamental rights of citizens until more consistent steps are taken. It is important to remember that criminal sentences still remain in personal records of all former political prisoners in Belarus who should not have been jailed in the first place. They continue to experience economic, social, and political limitations due to their ex-convict status. Besides political persecution of dissent, civic space in Belarus remains severely constrained, limiting the ability of organizations, activists, media, and lawyers to advance human rights and fundamental freedoms domestically. NGOs remain burdened by the complicated and selectively applied registration requirements that are supplemented by criminal liability for activists working on behalf of unregistered organizations. Opportunities to receive foreign support are severely limited. Independent journalism and freelancing are stifled through frivolous application of existing laws. Civil society leaders, activists, and journalists are routinely placed under travel bans. Considering the 2-decade decline in the freedoms of association, assembly, and expression, Freedom House strongly encourages the OSCE and the participating states to hold Belarus accountable to its obligations under the Helsinki Final Act. It is crucial that the OSCE provide an uncompromising assessment of the events leading to, during, and immediately after the October 11th presidential elections, including feasibility of independent election monitoring by civil society groups and the right for peaceful assembly. Freedom House urges the Belarusian government, as a participating state to the Helsinki Accords, to demonstrate that it is acting in good faith and implementing a comprehensive reform to strengthen its support for human rights. It should, among many steps, expunge the criminal record of all former political prisoners, allow civic activists to advocate for fundamental freedoms without fear of reprisal, whether through a registered organization or not, simplify registration and reporting procedures for NGOs, remove limitations on the ability of NGOs to receive foreign assistance, cease persecution of freelancing journalists covering socio-political issues, and repeal unnecessary media accreditation requirements, as was recommended by the Office of the OSCE Representative on Freedom of the Media in 2008. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Center for Economic and Social Development will now take the floor, followed by the delegation of Ireland. Center for Economic and Social Development.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm Ahmed Alili. I'm going to present on the situation in Azerbaijan regarding civil society organizations. For the last 2 days, the name of Azerbaijan has been mentioned numerous times in this conference, and mostly in the negative context. And we are grateful for this attention, for the care for the civil society organizations in Azerbaijan right now. And we think that together we can overcome all the obstacles that we are facing today in Azerbaijan. And the most of the speech that I was witnessed for the last 2 days, they were describing the general situation in Azerbaijan, and we were lacking some details. And we thought that as a member of the civil society organization in Azerbaijan, we should tell you more about these issues. And especially the most of the speeches, they are so general that there are the causes, the roots of the problems in Azerbaijan, they are not mentioned. And we think that this point should be mentioned out. We think that the problem of in Azerbaijan right now can be labeled as the distrust between the international donors and the national government. We think that that's the cause of the old troubles that civil society organizations are facing now. Because some of the international donors, and there was some activities and funded by the international donors, they were not undeclared. And that led to the mass checking of the activities of civil society organizations, and our organization was one of those organizations whose activities were checked. And we were, right now our activities, it's limited because of this distrust. We believe that undeclared activities should be treated in a more transparent manner, and we welcome all kind of transparency initiatives by all parties to deal the current problem in Azerbaijan. And due to time limitations, our statement will be circulated, but we think that sometimes the government's feeling that being punished for its activities and for its political agenda, that makes it less inclined for the dialogue, and that's the problem right now we are facing. So I would love to you be more informed on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The Irish delegation, followed by the International Federation for Human Rights. Ireland, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. My name is Philip McDonough. I'm the Irish Permanent Representative in Vienna. Ireland is fully associated with the intervention that has just been made by my British colleague, Ambassador MacLeod, in the name of the European Union. I wish to add a few comments from a national perspective on the role of national human rights institutions. This is a topic in which Ireland has a particular interest, and indeed we have very recent experience of creating a new national institution. We have merged our Equality Authority and our Human Rights Commission, and the new body, the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, came into effect as from the 1st of November last year. Across the range of OSCE participating states, we sometimes see quite a complex institutional landscape in this area. Merging everything is not necessarily the answer. Specific priority areas may still need a dedicated institution. In Ireland, we have an ombudsman for children. In other participating states, for example, gender equality is seen as warranting a specific organizational focus. But in our review in Ireland, we were impressed by the work of the EU Fundamental Rights Agency and its call for at least a framework that would seek to bring coherence to what, from the citizen's perspective, can be a confusing and complex landscape. From the perspective of the individual seeking assistance, it doesn't matter whether the transgression of personal rights relates to human rights law or equality and anti-discrimination legislation or maladministration within the system of public administration. From a legal and administrative angle, these may be different concepts, but the challenge is to ensure that we provide a cohesive service. The merger of our domestic institutions allowed us space to ask a wider question about how these institutions have functioned in Europe over the last 20 years or more. That's a topic for a seminar all by itself, but I would like to mention some elements that we took into account in our domestic reform. Full compliance with the Paris Principles, integration of human rights and equality in the mandate of the Commission, independence from government, and a role for the Commission to work with public bodies in a supportive and developmental way. We are happy to share this experience with other OSCE participating states and are delighted to have been invited by the chair of the Human Dimension Committee, by Norway, to make a formal presentation at the meeting in Vienna on the 3rd of November. I can confirm that we will be there with a strong team and are looking forward to that event. Thank you, Madam Moderator.
Thank you very much. I will now give the floor to the International Federation for Human Rights, followed by the delegation of Switzerland.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. The Observatory for the Protection of Human Rights Defenders, Joint FIDH and OMCT program wishes to draw your attention to the ongoing threats faced by the human rights NGOs in Azerbaijan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Russia, Hungary, Moldova, and Turkey. In Azerbaijan, following a series of blatantly unfair trials that took place last spring and summer, human rights defenders were sentenced to lengthy prison terms on spurious charges. Journalist Hadija Ismailova, human rights defenders Leila and Arif Yunus, Rasul Jafarov, lawyer Intigam Aliyev are currently serving prison terms going up to 8.5 years. Their lawyers are being harassed. For example, Khalid Bagirov was recently disbarred. Election monitor Anar Mamadli and minority rights defender Hilal Mamadov remain behind bars. Repressive legislation violating the right of freedom of association often serves as a basis for charges against human rights defenders. In Kyrgyzstan, human rights defender Azimjan Askarov continues to serve a life sentence, while the legislative framework for human rights work is seriously under threat. Last June, the parliament voted in first reading in favor of the so-called Foreign Agents Bill, an exact copy of the Russian legislation on the matter. Another bill, adopted by a large majority in second reading, imposes penalties for merely expressing positive attitudes towards non-traditional sexual relations. Finally, human rights lawyers are being attacked, as in the case of unlawful searches in the residences of lawyers working for human rights organization Berduino. In Uzbekistan, the situation remains dramatic, with human rights defenders in prison, exiled, or silenced. The release of imprisoned defenders after they served their terms is hindered, as was the case with Azamjan Farmonov, due to be released last April. And after 9 years in prison, he was convicted to another 5 for allegedly violating prison rules. 2 human rights defenders were severely beaten just yesterday while monitoring human rights violations. In Russia, the Grozny office of the Joint Mobile Group, led by the Committee Against Torture, was violently attacked by an organized mob last June. Last July, the status of foreign agent was confirmed in appeal for the Committee Against Torture. Earlier, many other NGOs, including the NGO Planet of Hopes, defending the right to life in nuclear-contaminated areas, was sentenced for refusing voluntary registration as foreign agent. Planet of Hope's director Nadezhda Kutepova was groundlessly accused of industrial espionage on national television. In Moldova, de facto Transnistrian KGB publicly called the work of human rights organization Promolex a threat to its security and opened a criminal case against it. The situation is worrying in Hungary, where the authorities led a smear campaign against human rights NGOs in an attempt to silence them. In Turkey, the counter-terrorism offensive launched over the past months led to grave violations of the right to life and to repressive actions targeting human rights groups. In this context, the Observatory urges the OC chairmanship to nominate a personal representative on human rights defenders in charge of raising with national governments individual cases of violations of their rights. We call the participating states to publicly commit to implement the OC guidelines on human rights defenders. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The delegation of Switzerland will be followed by the International Group on Crimes Against the Person, Switzerland.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. My comments will focus on freedom of assembly and association as well as human rights association. Switzerland is convinced that the freedom of association and assembly, together with a strong independent civil society, are the very base for any stable, prosperous, democratic society. Moreover, restrictions on this freedom are the preferred measure of governments who seek to bolster their power at the expense of a plural, participative policy. Peaceful gatherings and associations enable those who take part to publicly voice their concerns outside the official framework of referenda and elections. Switzerland is strongly committed to protecting and promoting human rights through peaceful demonstrations. At the UN Human Rights Council, it was the main instigator of 3 resolutions on this very theme adopted in 2012, 2013 and 2014, and it endorses the special rapporteurs of the UN in setting up practical recommendations on the procedure for authorizing and interventions of the security forces during peaceful gatherings. The debate on the management of demonstrations, and in particular the balance between the need for respect of human rights and guaranteeing public order, is held at national level in Switzerland as well. At the OSCE, Switzerland supports the activities of ODIHR, which seeks to strengthen freedom of association and assembly, in particular the publication of guidelines on peaceful gatherings. Through its strong expertise, this institution is in a strong position to offer participating OSCE states legal assistance in order to set up international standards and the commitments taken within the OSCE. These guidelines complete the guidelines on the protection of human rights published under the Swiss presidency of the OSCE in 2014. Switzerland, in this regard, has the following recommendations, 2 recommendations. It calls on all states in the region to recognize and fulfill their obligations regarding the right of assembly and association, and it calls on them to actively make use of the expertise and the tools provided by the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, ODIHR. Human rights activists and all those who, as individuals or as a group, seek to criticize the authorities must be protected from administrative and legal harassment on the part of authorities. Therefore, we encourage the relevant institutions of the OSCE, as well as all the participating states, to maintain dialogue with human rights activists and to provide appropriate support to them in relation to their situation and needs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will now invite the International Group on Crimes Against the Person, followed by the Interregional Social Movement for Democracy and Human Rights.
Господин председатель.
Madam Moderator, dear colleagues, I represent an international human rights group which is called the International Group on Crimes Against the Person. Now, from the start of the civil society movement in Ukraine, we collect information about massive violations of human rights that are committed. Now, however, throughout our period of activity, we have been confronted with problems caused to us by the Ukrainian authorities, because we managed to identify the facts of human rights violations committed by government forces, by pro-government groups, and some people don't like that. Now, I'd like to draw the attention of the European community to the fact that as of today, a report prepared by us, an annual report about massive violations of human rights that have occurred in Ukraine over 13, 14 years, has in fact been forbidden for publication and dissemination in Ukraine. That occurred on 11 August when the state body published a list of books that are banned on the territory of Ukraine. Now, we consider that to be a direct violation of the right to freedom of information, freedom of speech. It is a restriction on the actions of human rights defenders, and we believe that this is a direct violation also of the freedom of association. So that's really all I wanted to say, and I very much hope that European organizations, the OSCE in particular, will take that glaring fact into consideration. Thank you.
The Interregional Social Movement for Democracy and Human Rights will be followed by the delegation of Ukraine.
Здравствуйте, Олеся.
My name is Alessaria, and I'm with the Interregional Social Movement for Democracy and Human Rights. I would like to draw your attention to a very interesting and important idea expressed by one of our introducers, namely that people should have the right to go out into the streets and express their opinions freely. And there have been clear violations of that right in many countries, and that is true in Ukraine as well. I'd like to draw your attention to the fact, to remind you that starting last year with the elections to Parliament, there have been numerous attacks on activists, on representatives of various political parties and movements. And these attacks have been perpetrated by certain radical groups, and unfortunately, such attacks are continuing to occur to this day. Let me just share some facts with you, very recent facts. On 24 August of this year in Odessa, there was an attack on the representatives of the opposition bloc. Some 10 individuals from the Azov battalion attacked members of that movement. They beat them up, and I would draw attention to the fact that one of the representatives of that bloc, Andrei Atelevich, managed to identify 3 of the attackers, and one of them turned out to be an assistant to a Ukrainian parliamentarian, Andrei Belevsky, and he was a member of the Azov battalion. Now, of course, the police does nothing to investigate such events. In Krimomrod, there was also an attack on the opposition bloc who was involved in a public demonstration. People in balaclavas wearing a nationalist insignia, and that was not investigated. And I think that such a non-investigation is simply because the attackers are members, in fact, of the forces of law and order. I mean, they represent the nationalists. But thank you for your attention.
The delegation of Ukraine will have the floor now, followed by the Citizens' Labor Rights Protection League. Ukraine, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ms. Moderator. Ukraine aligns itself with the statement made by the delegation of the European Union, and would like to make some additional remarks in our national capacity. For Ukraine and its people, the right to freedom of peaceful assembly has a symbolic and very important meaning, as its effective exercise, especially throughout the last decade, has become a cornerstone for paving the way towards truly democratic European society, based on the rule of law and committed to the human rights and fundamental freedoms. This is also the freedom that the Ukrainian society cherishes particularly, as it allowed to clearly voice out its European aspirations and shape our country's destiny when in November 2013 the millions of Ukrainians in different parts of the country came into the streets to peacefully express their support for Ukraine's European future, democratic values and reforms. Dear participants, Ukraine remains fully committed to protecting, strengthening and promoting the fundamental freedoms of peaceful assembly and association, which are guaranteed by the Constitution of Ukraine. The National Human Rights Strategy, approved by the President of Ukraine in August, contains a separate chapter dedicated to freedom of peaceful assembly and association, and is aimed at ensuring in law and in practice the exercise of the rights to freedom of peaceful assembly and association. It is expected that its implementation will result in adoption of a clear legislation on freedom of peaceful assembly, as well as improve the safety aspects of peaceful assemblies, to minimize the government's interventions in the establishment, activity and termination of public associations throughout registration procedures, as well as will introduce equal and transparent conditions for access of public associations to state financing. In this context, Ukraine seeks to duly apply the extensive expertise of the OSCE ODIHR and the Venice Commission of the Council of Europe, and we highlight the importance of the 2 joint OSCE ODIHR Venice Commission guidelines on freedom of peaceful assembly and on freedom of association. Ladies and gentlemen, against the backdrop of the Russian aggression against Ukraine, we remain deeply alarmed over the systematic violation of human rights and fundamental freedoms by the occupying authorities in Crimea, targeting first and foremost Crimean Tatars and pro-Ukrainian activists, as well as by Russia-backed militants in the illegally occupied parts of Donetsk Oblast and Lugansk Oblast. Freedom of peaceful assembly and association are among the first targets in the affected region. We are gravely concerned that residents of those parts of Ukraine cannot freely exercise their right to freedom of peaceful assembly and association and expression. Among the most grave examples are the severe restrictions and bans on traditional commemorative events of Crimean Tatars dedicated deportations by Stalin regimes and Crimean Tatar flags, as well as on the occasion of Ukrainian Independence Day. Therefore, we reiterate the need to in the independent international monitoring of the situation in the occupied Crimea to assess the state of human rights and fundamental freedoms on the ground. Thank you, Ms. Moderator.
Thank you very much. I will now ask the Citizens' Labor Rights Protection League, followed by the delegation of the Netherlands.
Спасибо.
Thank you. My name is Sain Mammadov from Azerbaijan. Unfortunately, in the region of the OSCE, there is growing tension and more restrictions on human rights and the activities of civil society. Unfortunately, neither last year nor this year have I heard any report that would analyze the situation and really explain to us why this is occurring in the region and why the tension is rising. I must say that I'm really impressed by the lack of information underpinning the reports that we hear. I mean, either it's some sort of NGO that is in cahoots with the government. Obviously, there isn't an attempt to obtain information from different sources in order to assess the situation objectively. For instance, 4 NGOs received 20 million euros in grants to engage in anti-Azerbaijan activity. I mean, they put on T-shirts that slander the Azerbaijani people. Now, I'm not opposed to T-shirts, but to send these incompetent, uninformed people who read out a statement and then to go away. I mean, what does this really help? I mean, does it really serve any purpose? Tens of people have left the country to Western Europe, but none of them have really been persecuted. I mean, you know, that doesn't help their people. And there are non-governmental organizations that are receiving tens of millions. They invest them or they use them for legal services in order to get refugee status elsewhere. I mean, it essentially amounts to money laundering. And this is perhaps contributing to that tension. And we need to talk about the problems. Well, in Azerbaijan, yes, there are problems with human rights. There are problems with restrictions imposed on civil society. But it is the European organizations that are to blame for this. I mean, why do they funnel this money into dubious groups? I mean, why is there no investigation of the actions that they engage in on the strength of that money? In fact, if you look at accounts in European banks, well, there is monitoring of accounts in accordance with the UN Convention, and it was explained to our civil servants that there is this underground process of transfer of money. Thank you for your attention.
I will now give the floor to the delegation of the Netherlands, followed by the International Partnership for Human Rights. Netherlands, you have the floor.
Thank you, Moderator. The Netherlands fully aligns itself with the statement by the European Union. Support for human rights defenders and enabling environment for civil society is a core priority of Dutch policy. Human rights defenders are key actors and partners contributing to furthering fundamental rights and freedoms in their society. Their work promotes democratization, accountability, and stability. Freedom of assembly and association are essential prerequisites for them to be able to operate. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights said during the opening of the 30th Human Rights Council last week that he and his predecessor have enumerated at the Human Rights Council states that have taken extremely serious steps to restrict or persecute the voices of civil society. While he will continue to list them, he was devastated to have to report them that there are now too many countries on that list for him to name during that session. We can speak of a trend, and a very negative one. The Netherlands is concerned by restrictions of the freedom of assembly and association within the OSCE region. We notice barriers to registering NGOs, barriers to funding and resources, as well as barriers to organize and assemble. In Azerbaijan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Russia, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Turkey, laws, regulations, and practices restrict either one or both of these freedoms. We therefore urge all these participating states to implement their OSCE commitments and guarantee the rights of freedoms of association and assembly. It is important that we can openly discuss the implementation of these rights, including with our civil society partners, and we appreciate that HDM provides many opportunities to do this. Freedom of association and assembly applies equally to LGBTI people. When peaceful marches or demonstrations are held, states have an obligation to ensure that participants are protected from violence. We commend the Serbian authorities in this regard, who have recently shown leadership in protecting and promoting these basic human rights by expressing and demonstrating their support for the organization of the Gay Pride. However, in other countries, we see restrictions to the rights of freedom of expression, association, and assembly of LGBTI people. The Netherlands is particularly concerned about draft legislation to restrict these freedoms currently considered by the Kyrgyz parliament. Criminalizing the dissemination of information on so-called non-traditional sexual relations means silencing an already vulnerable and discriminated minority. The OSCE commitments regarding non-discrimination and fundamental freedoms apply to all people without exception, regardless of frontiers. We therefore urge the Parliament, as well as the President of Kyrgyzstan, to guarantee the rights of freedom of expression, association and assembly of all people, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will just want to announce before asking the next speaker that we will close the speakers list in 1-2 minutes. So if anyone wants to register still, please do so now. And I will now give the floor to the International Partnership for Human Rights, followed by the delegation of Tajikistan.
Thank you, moderator. I'm speaking on behalf of 6 organizations: the International Partnership for Human Rights, the Kazakhstan International Bureau for Human Rights and Rule of Law, Nota Bene, the Turkmen Initiative for Human Rights, the Association for Human Rights in Central Asia, and the Voice of Freedom Foundation. When UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon visited Central Asia this summer, he spoke about, quote, a shrinking democratic space across the region and warned against using security threats to place further limits on fundamental rights such as the freedoms of expression, assembly, and association. He said, "I see this phenomenon on the rise in the region and it troubles me greatly. It troubles us greatly as well. Across Central Asia, we are now seeing an alarming trend of curtailing fundamental rights and freedoms and clamping down on civil society in the name of ensuring security and stability. New legislation restricting the operation and funding of NGOs has been adopted or is considered in several countries of the region, and independent groups working on human rights and other so-called sensitive issues have come under growing pressure. The right to hold peaceful protests is limited on the pretext of preventing unrest. Political opposition parties and independent trade unions are forced to stop their activities where they have been able to operate at all. Civil society activists, lawyers, dissidents, and others who criticize government policies and speak up for human rights, justice, and rule of law are stigmatized, intimidated, harassed, and locked up on politically motivated grounds. Some critical voices have been imprisoned for years. This is only a brief summary of current serious concerns regarding the civil society situation in Central Asia. You can find more details in a joint written statement that our organizations have prepared for this session. We call on the OSCE participating states to speak out against the trend of stifling civil society in the name of stability and to insist, as Ban Ki-moon emphasized during his Central Asia visit, that the way to a more stable future in this region and elsewhere is not more repression, but more openness and more human rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I will now invite the delegation of Tajikistan, followed by the Institute of Go-Governance.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, our government is cooperating with many associations. There's support from the state on issues regarding human rights, women's rights, and the handicapped. We would point out that since 2010 and up to 2015, Tajikistan has had an active policy. We have prepared a review on human rights for the Human Rights Council of the UN, national reports also submitted to the UN. The conclusions were submitted, included many recommendations, and implementation of which is being dealt at national level. In implementation of this, the government bodies work with relevant associations, and in 2015, as part of the implementation of the Human Rights Plan, we've had a rounds of consultations with civil society. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to point out that regarding the law, where there's been some controversy on human rights activists, Tajikistan since 2002 has been countering money laundering, further to the specialist body in this field, in order to prevent money laundering. The recommendations have been enshrined in legislation to counter money laundering, and in order to achieve this, we have a special law with amendments in 2015. The law provides for procedures to provide information on financial assistance, and this is in no way intended to hinder the activities of NGOs. We also have a broad consultation with civil society and international organizations. We have had comments, and we have taken on board and acted on the basis of some of the recommendations that were made. Thank you.
I will now invite the Institute of Go-Governance, followed by the Ombudsman of the Republic of Tajikistan. The Institute of Go-Governance.
Thank you. The Institute for Go-Governance is engaged in promoting good governance, quality democracy via various projects in the Black Sea region, with conferences, publications in the West Balkans too, and in former countries of the Soviet Union, but also assessing the state of democratic governance in more mature democracies in Western Europe. Quality governance involves the development of mere quantitative democracy, for example, an extension of the right to vote to more people, and progresses to look at how effective institutions such as political parties, parliament, and ministries are functioning, and what possibilities there are between elections to express views, protest, and bring about policy change. This requires, obviously, an open media, an opposition free to operate, and a mature public able to articulate without fear of reprisal. Clearly, we cannot measure on a one-to-one basis the developments or problems facing mature democracies with those in, for example, Belarus. A blanket condemnation of the country as hopeless authoritarianism or whatever label does little to encourage genuine civil society work going on in very difficult circumstances. The release of political prisoners is a good sign that the country is at least sensitive to the external image it has in the international community, but sustainability for free opposition work should be demonstrated and not done as a cosmetic pre-election move. It is all important, however, to recognise the endemic political culture, but these can be changed. There should be mutual confidence and trust between leaders and the voters so that both are free from fear of what might happen if democratic governance is furthered. The experience and best practices of different countries can help, but countries have to find their own ways with experts on the ground. Not one size fits all, but the individual approach requires more time, more patience, and above all, extra funding. However, we should not leave good projects stranded without hope. And in this sense, initiatives trying to identify genuine civil society in countries like Belarus deserve support without ignoring the very real problems in these countries.
Thank you very much. I have just been informed that the list of speakers has been closed now. I will now invite the Ombudsman of the Republic of Tajikistan, followed by the Historical Memory Foundation.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to draw your attention to 2 points. The first one has to do with education in the field of human rights, and the second one, cooperation between our NHRIs and civil society. Now, education and awareness raising for human rights in transitional developing countries is very important. In a country like Tajikistan, we're moving into a new form of a societal organization, and we have to take into consideration very important principles to protect human rights. So in our country, we are implementing 3 programs. The first one was adopted in 2001, and the second one in 2012. It's called a program or a campaign to educate the society of Tajikistan in human rights in the period through to 2020. So it's a question of supporting a culture of human rights, educating for human rights. This covers all social groups. It's targeted at everyone. It is, in fact, obligatory in all educational institutions. In our country, it covers 3 stages. It was a continuation of a previous program for the period 2010-2014. It was developed and designed in cooperation with the OSCE office in Tajikistan. It was consulted broadly with international experts and with civil society in my country. Now, of course, if one looks at the experience of the implementation of this program, it's clear that this is something that's very important and useful and necessary, not just in educational institutions, but also it should be targeted at the forces of law and order in my country. They, too, need to become more aware of norms and standards in the field of human rights. People who work for the police, for instance, need to know about freedom of association and other human rights principles and standards. And now, I would like to say that the OSCE offices in our developing countries are very useful institutions, and I think that they should cooperate with national institutions and with civil society. They should perhaps be more involved in awareness raising about the obligations of civil servants when it comes to protecting human rights. Thank you.
Just say to the delegations that we still have 20 speakers on the list, and we already have 10 registered rights to reply. So please, when preparing your statements, make it about 1 minute long. Thank you. And now we will ask the Historical Memory Foundation, followed by the delegation of Serbia.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Djukov. I represent the Historical Memory Foundation. I'd like to speak about the danger, threat, which is not often discussed, namely the fact that the so-called memorial laws governing the past, the society's memory, are subjugated or represent human rights violations. On the 15th of May, the Ukrainian parliament adopted, and President Poroshenko signed a law on decommunism, and the measures taken by the Ukrainian government are particularly harsh. In particular, they provide as a criminal offense the denial of specific historical events or symbols for certain laws in Eastern Europe. And these laws were considered to be, for example, this involved the dismantling of certain statues, symbols, without any discussion. They contributed to the divisions of society, and a whole series of measures. These laws drew objections from the OSCE. There is concern over the fact that these laws may impact on freedom of expression, and this is quite justified. However, this did not prevent these events from taking part. The adoption of these laws led to a whole wave of violence. First of all, there were attacks on monuments, which are being, or statues, which are being dismantled, which represent an act of aggression. And this involves physical destruction of these monuments and symbols. Those who voiced their opposition, hostility to this, Ukrainians, inhabitants of Kiev, for example, are threatened. They're threatened and they're subjected to physical intimidation. Charges are pressed against them, and furthermore, unfortunately, these threats do not remain mere threats. They're actually carried out. A few days ago, for example, at the end of August in Kharkov, one man was beaten up by a group of radicals in full view of the police. This is what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you. The delegation of Serbia, followed by the Human Rights Educational Center. Serbia, you have the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Jelena Pajovic van Rein. I'm from the Government Office for Cooperation with Civil Society of Serbia, and I would like to use this opportunity to share with you some of the experiences and practices related to functioning of civil society in Serbia that might be interesting for participating states. In the moment, legal framework enables associations to register in speedy and simple manner. Registration process of associations can be finalized in 5 days, and all the necessary documents and forms are available online. In addition, the process of applying for state funding recently has been simplified by reducing the range of documents that is needed in the application procedure. When it comes to budget planning and allocation of budget resources, the Office for Cooperation with Civil Society prepares annually summary reports on budget resources allocated for the association and civil society organizations from the budget of Republic of Serbia in order to improve regular budget planning and expenditure. Regarding other activities of our office, let me briefly mention that the office supported the inclusion of civil society organizations and other interested public in the law and policy-making process by preparing relevant guidelines, which were later adopted by the government. Those guidelines, as well as the first national strategy for creating enabling environment for the civil society development, which is to be adopted soon, represent a step towards the systematic regulation of cooperation between state authorities and civil society organizations. Furthermore, in the strategy, we partly deal with the human rights education by envisaging further improvement of conditions for non-formal education and improving the role of civil society organization in this process. I would like to take this opportunity to thank OSCE mission to Serbia for cooperation with our office and the support to civil society organizations, and to emphasize the importance of establishing of our office in 2010 as an important step towards a more structural cooperation between the government and the civil society. We believe that communication, interaction, and cooperation of all sectors are essential for development and progress of any society. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I will now give the floor to the Human Rights Educational Center, followed by the Human Rights House Foundation. Human Rights Educational Center, please.
Belarus Center. Belarus has a dictatorship and a dictator, Alexander Lukashenko, and therefore there is no human rights. We recall the definition of human rights by Lukashenko. He said, human rights, the first human right is the right to a job, to a decent wage. Are you suggesting that we don't have that? And what we find is that this year the dictator himself denied his own definition. Wages are not the main thing. On the other hand, the dictator has set up a new tax on citizens who do not have a job, on so-called parasites. Of course, the dictator Lukashenko has forgotten his promise in 2010 that there would be a $1,000 average wage. So that's the backdrop in Belarus. Freedom of peaceful assembly and association. Belarus does not have this. NGOs and parties, for example, the Christian Democrats or democratic parties, are not registered. And there is a Damocles sword that hangs, the criminal code that hangs over the heads of citizens who are active in non-registered NGOs. We have no human rights institutions in Belarus. Even if the dictator agrees to the establishment of an ombudsman, in actual fact, he will not uphold political rights of citizens. As for social rights, the example of other dictators shows that in this regard, puppet ombudsmen are not active. Civil society is trying to uphold human rights, but without the help of international organization, there cannot be any positive impact whatsoever. Education in human rights in Belarus is at a very low ebb. The second national plan for human rights does not exist to this day. In secondary schools, there is no program for human rights education. The government, however, does accept literature publications from the OSCE and ODIHR. We're grateful to ODIHR for not forgetting the problem, grateful for their help for the program on human rights guiding principles. And we recall what was said by Mr. Link, who said that it's not only a matter of it's not only a matter of knowing human rights, you actually have to have them. Unfortunately, NGOs in Belarus are not active. This year, Belarus was admitted to the Bologna process, and there is some hope that there will be human rights education. Ladies and gentlemen, we would remind you that there is discrimination against the Belarus language, which is officially a state language. At a recent press conference, in response to a question by a question from a journalist asking about the support of the government for Belarus language, he rudely answered, "The language issue is closed." We recall that we should pay approximately 80% of recommendations. We call on ODIHR, the OSCE, to continue their work on the theme of human rights education. We ask ODIHR, OSCE, the EU, the Council of Europe, given the thaw in relations with Belarus, to convince Alexander Lukashenko to adopt the 5-year national plan on human rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The Human Rights House Foundation, followed by the delegation of Slovenia.
Thank you. The Human Rights House Foundation calls upon the OSCE member states to publicly condemn cases of threats, persecution and violence against human rights defenders or other forms of harassment. We see an increase in strategic discrimination by authoritarian states towards selective part of society when it comes to enjoying the right to freedom of association and assembly. Many of our partners in Russia, Belarus and Azerbaijan are hindered to do their work due to restrictive legislation. In a few days, on October 11th, a new presidential election will take place in Belarus. Although political prisoners have been released this fall, the restrictive laws hindering the right to freedom of assembly and association are still in place. Before any other political engagement with Belarus, we call upon the OSCE participating states to request full and open cooperation with international human rights monitoring mechanism and legislative and practical changes to ensure space for civil society to work and express its opinions. Later this year, in November 2015, Azerbaijan will hold its parliamentary elections. These elections will take place in a climate where almost all leading civil society actors are either in prison or had to flee the country. The arbitrary use of organizational charges to imprison civil society actors violates the state's obligation under international law. In light of the recent cancellation of the OSCE ODIHR parliamentary election observation, we call upon OSCE to take concrete steps to address the deterioration of the situation related to the crackdown of the civil society. In Crimea, human rights organizations are facing restrictions related to their work. In the Russian Federation, civil society organizations remain under pressure of being at any given time qualified as foreign agents and hence de facto labeled as enemies of the state or as undesirable and thus criminalized. OSCE needs to react clearer to the deteriorating situation in Russia to not lose credibility. Lawyers defending leaders of targeted organizations or activists detained during protests are also facing increased pressure in Belarus, Russia and Azerbaijan. This we have documented in a report, Human Rights Lawyers at Risk, which will be presented at a side event today at the Agora room after this session, together with other organizations such as ABA, ODIHR and Lawyers for Lawyers. Thank you.
Thank you. The delegation of Slovenia, followed by the Kazakhstan International Bureau for Human Rights and Rule of Law. Slovenia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. We fully support our joint EU statement, but let me focus on human rights education from national perspective. Slovenia continues to implement human rights education nationally, internationally, and within the platform for human rights education and training, which is an informal cross-regional grouping of states promoting human rights education in the UN framework. The platform also promotes the World Programme for Human Rights Education, now already in its third phase addressed to the mass media. The observance and full respect of human rights depends on how well, how wide, and for whom human rights education and training is implemented. The Declaration on Human Rights Education and Training, adopted in the UN General Assembly in December 2011, should serve as a crucial tool in this regard. Both governments and civil society should be encouraged to implement it, perhaps best in working together. Slovenia is very pleased that in the third phase of the World Programme has begun in 2015, addressing the need to educate and train media workers. They are definitely key in reaching out to larger population. They also have a huge potential in multiplying the effect of human rights education, which includes tolerance education and respect for the so-called other in every sense of the word. Fighting negative stereotyping, also in the current refugee crisis, is important more than ever before. We look forward to hearing about good practices from governments and the civil society on educating and training the media in human rights. We can also proudly inform that the Slovenian project, Our Rights, designed for children in the age of identification, 10, 12 years old, has been implemented in numerous societies in the past 10 years. In 2014 and 2015, it is being additionally implemented also in Jordan, Morocco, and Egypt. Slovenia is ready to further promoting the commitments of the OSCE strategy to address threats to security and stability in the 21st century, which refers to human rights education with emphasis on the younger generation. Educating and training the young generation on human rights with all available means, formally and informally, in schools and through media and other channels of communication, is one of the best investments in the respect of human rights and thus healthier future of our societies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will now give the floor to the Kazakhstan International Bureau for Human Rights and Rule of Law, followed by the Protection of Rights Without Borders.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. This is the statement on behalf of 21 Kazakh NGO. The Majlis Lower Chamber of the Parliament of Kazakhstan is currently considering the draft bill on introducing amendments and addenda to several legislative acts of the Republic of Kazakhstan relating to activities of non-governmental organizations. Once adopted, this draft bill will adversely affect the enjoyment of human rights. It will first of all threaten the legitimate exercise of the right to freedom of association, right to choose freely one's occupation, right to freedom of opinion and expression, i.e. the essence of civil society. The draft may introduce the monopoly of one single operator to distribute grants irrespective of sources, be it international organizations, diplomatic missions, international non-commercial organizations, etc., anytime without introducing addenda to the legislation by arbitrary interpretation of the bill. In addition, the draft introduces mandatory submission of information by NGOs to a database of non-governmental organizations. Non-compliance in the form of the failure to provide such information or provide it with irregularities entails administrative liability in the Code of Administrative Offenses, such as administrative fine or suspension of NGO activities for up to 3 months and subsequently closure of the NGO. This is a blatant intervention by the state into the activities of public organizations in whatever form these organizations are registered, and in the Kazakhstan context, this will result in prosecution and subsequent closure of independent NGOs, similarly to what is already happening in Russia or Tajikistan. As a matter of principle, we object to limiting the areas of activities of NGOs receiving grants from any sources, not only from the state. The list of areas of NGO activities specified in Article 5 of the draft bill does not include human rights and democracy, protection of the rights of migrants, refugees, and state-led persons, which will eventually lead to human rights NGOs engaged in promotion and protection of human rights being excluded from the legal space and closed any time after the bill is adopted. The competent authorized body, the Ministry of Culture and Sport, will have the right and authority to check information provided by NGOs, branches and representations offices of the international non-profit organizations from the NGO database. The Ministry decision will determine which NGOs are to be closed on the grounds of failure to provide information. Therefore, if the draft bill is adopted the way it is at the moment, it will result in the situation when independent non-governmental organizations will be not able to function even without grants. The most worrying fact is that the Parliament, being a democratic body, adopts undemocratic laws as provisions unacceptable to NGOs have been introduced by members of the Parliament. At all stages of the law drafting process, of the draft closer to compliance with the Kazakhstan Constitution and international human rights law principles and international best practices in the area of promotion and protection of human rights. We are calling, based on that, we are appealing to the international community to appeal to the President of Kazakhstan as the guarantor of the Constitution with 2 claims. Have the draft bill reviewed by the Constitutional Council of the Republic of Kazakhstan for its compliance with the Constitution, and also by the Council of Europe Venice Commission for its compliance with the National Human Rights Statute, as well by the OSCE ODIHR, and veto the bill in case of its adoption by the Parliament of Kazakhstan. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next will be Protection of Rights Without Borders, followed by Civil Activity Fund. Protection of Rights Without Borders.
Thank you very much. I am making this statement on behalf of 3 non-governmental human rights organizations working in Armenia: Helsinki Committee of Armenia, Protection of Rights Without Borders, and Helsinki Citizens Assembly Vanadzor Office. We voiced our big concern about the situation of right to freedom of assembly in the Republic of Armenia. The law on freedom of peaceful assembly was adopted in 2011. According to the law, in case of more than 100 participants, the authorities should not only allow the assembly, but take the notification into consideration to ensure security. In addition to assemblies demanding prior notification, the law also foresees the right to prompt and spontaneous assemblies. The progress of the law is expressed in the approach that, irrespective of the nature of assembly, if it's peaceful, the police is obliged to facilitate the assembly. The regulations of the law generally are more in line with international standards. However, the provisions are not fully implemented. During the last year, Helsinki Committee of Armenia monitored more than 100 peaceful assemblies, where many cases of violence were observed and recorded. We would like to bring the following examples of police violence during peaceful assemblies. On 15 January, in Liberty Square in Yerevan, the assembly took place in the memory of the killed family by the Russian soldier in Gyumri. During this assembly, unknown people in civilian clothes, as later turned out police officers, as well as police officers in uniforms, used violence against the participants of peaceful assembly and forcibly took dozens of them to the police stations. On 11 February and 13 May, in the front of the president's residency, the police used the force against a peaceful group of military servicemen parents who were trying to bring attention of ineffective investigation of deaths of sons, soldiers. The police rudely shot the parents, forcibly drove them away to the opposite sidewalk of the street. More massive instances of violence were observed in the morning of 23rd June during the rally and sit-in, which was dispersed by special police units and other servants. Numerous instances of violence and excessive use of force were observed while dispersing the rally and arresting the participants. At least the total number of arrested demonstrators was almost 240. For all such actions, the police remained unpunished and unaccountable to the public. These examples and the results of monitoring prove that the Armenian authorities failed to ensure the protection of freedom of assembly. Moreover, all possible measures are taken to suppress and silence and protect activities. In this regard, we claim from the authorities to respect and ensure the effective implementation of the right to freedom of assembly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will now give the floor to the Civil Activity Fund, followed by the Center for Strategic Studies, TURSAM.
Добрый день.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rodbek Tibayev. I'm a citizen of Kazakhstan, but I now live in Poland, where I have been granted the status of refugee. Now, the subject of today's session covers inter alia the protection of human rights defenders, but apart from human rights defenders, there's one more category that wasn't mentioned by our rapporteur, namely those who have, against their will, become human rights defenders, compulsory. Vladimir Kozlov, my comrade, who's the leader of the National Party Alga, is one of those. President Nazarbayev has put him in jail for 7.5 years for events that occurred on 16 December 2011. Now, in his penal colony, he protected his human rights, he defended his human rights and the human rights of those who were imprisoned with him. And for this, a month ago, he was put into an isolation cell for 10 days. And for an extra year, he was put into a prison with severe restrictions, with 20 people in a barrack with a surface area of about 50 square meters. and this at a time when the temperature was up to 50 degrees centigrade. Now, in the course of this process, the director of the colony said he really wasn't happy with the complaints being written by Kozlov about the detention conditions, and why is he speaking out to protect other prisoners, other detainees. So there are these human rights defenders who find themselves forced to protect themselves against the abuses of totalitarian regimes. And I would like to draw your attention to the fact that human rights mechanisms just don't work in my country. The president of the country has set up a position of a human rights defender. This was formerly a police officer who was appointed a human rights ombudsman, if you will, and this individual speaks to the press and states that Kozlov has not been subject to any torture and that he is detained under normal conditions. But in fact, he isn't able to stand for long periods of time because of his medical condition, and he receives no care. There is also in Kazakhstan a so-called national preventive mechanism. In principle, it's a good idea, but it starts to click in when individuals have been detained for political reasons. I mean, it stops working, in the case of political prisoners. It really is only applied to common criminals. And I would like to draw attention of participants in this meeting that recently in Kazakhstan, the Communist Party of Kazakhstan was recently definitively closed down. It was one of the only opposition parties remaining. It's not just a question of closing down an ideology. There is also the National Communist Party in the country, which is just a puppet party. And that party was closed down because of upcoming parliamentary elections, and I would appeal to the OSCE very closely to monitor those elections. Thank you for your attention.
I will now give the floor to the Center for Strategic Studies, Tursam, followed by the Independent Human Rights Organization of Uzbekistan. Can I ask Tursam again to take the floor, please?
My name is Ataturk. Ladies and gentlemen, I greet you all, and I would like to draw your attention to what is going on in the world. Hundreds of thousands of refugees from the Middle East are fleeing persecution. The reason for this, Europe, instead of tells the whole world about human rights and freedom, I would like to point out that in Europe we have already seen the events in Karabakh. What can we say? If the Council of Europe cannot implement to this day resolutions that itself adopted, and if that's the case, then what rights can we talk about? You have had war between two brother countries. We've seen this in Ukraine, and we're hearing about the freedom, the liberation of others, but what we want is the freedom for Karabakh. We want the freedom of our territories of Tengam, Tirgaz, and we want there to be peace. Genocide is what is happening. We want to know that sooner or later we will achieve our goals. Thank you.
The Independent Human Rights Organization of Uzbekistan will now take the floor, followed by the Ombudsman of the Republic of Moldova.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm a human rights activist from Uzbekistan. Since last year, we've had some changes. There's some small steps that have been made in this. We have some civil rights progress. I spoke about this, but our state and recently the Justice Ministry, I don't know whether you're aware of this, but we're seeing that courts are beginning to fine our members. They've started to levy huge fines. Last year in Samarkand, our committee was fined 1 million. And it's interesting to note that in 2007 there was a presidential decree on guaranteeing guarantees for human rights. That's very good, but all very well, but the Justice Ministry are contradicting, in actual fact, this presidential decree. Usually, we have to provide advance notice of any small gathering, and even for a meeting in our own office, we need authorization. So this is inconsistent. International organizations earlier in the past, flagship democracies such as the European Union, the United States. Earlier, previously we had training, seminars, more contacts with them. We were able to have seminars for our young people, and over the past 5 years we have virtually no contacts, for example, with the American embassy. And apart from the OSCE, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the representative of the OSCE in Uzbekistan, because at least we have some minimal help from that quarter. And also the Polish embassy, who very kindly enabled us to get the visa. And international organizations which we have in our organization need more contacts with international organizations, multilateral organizations. This would be very helpful in implementing what we're all discussing at this forum. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The Ombudsman of the Republic of Moldova, followed by the delegation of Armenia.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Kuturbay. I'm the Ombudsman of the Republic of Moldova, and I'd like to make a comment regarding the young ombudsman. I'm a young ombudsman. I was appointed 3 months ago, and therefore institutes for human rights in Moldova are undergoing a reform, restructuring the Human Rights Center, the former Human Rights Center, which included formerly 4 parliamentary lawyers, has been discontinued, and we now has the ombudsman, and we have a human rights ombudsman. And therefore, I'd like to point out that the process of restructuring of the institute is moving quite slowly for the time being. The appointment of an ombudsman does not mean that you have an overall restructuring immediately of the organization. The government has undertaken certain measures, the parliament also, regarding legislation with laws, and this also includes organizational matters on the part of the government, such as providing premises for the center, appointment of staff and so forth. The International Lawyers Office is working and is fulfilling all the tasks under Decree number 52 of April 2014. The Ombudsman is the chair and provides the mechanism for a preventive policy, prevention of torture, and the Ombudsman of the Republic also closely cooperates with other institutions such as the Concilium Against Discrimination, the Conciliation for Equality, and we therefore carry out full duties regarding petitions, addresses, etc. I'd simply like to emphasize the following. The fact is, as you know, we have massive crimes. We have tents that have been set up in the center of our capital, and there is trying to mediate between the government and the people who are holding this sit-in. And I think that this process will go ahead peacefully, and we will in compliance with all fundamental human rights. Thank you very much.
Armenia, followed by the delegation of Azerbaijan. Armenia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. 2 days ago, Armenia celebrated the Day of Independence. Armenian people achieved the independence through claiming and exercising their human rights and fundamental freedoms, particularly freedom of assembly, and this fundamental freedom is very dear to us. I would like to seize this opportunity to present our recent national practices in this regard. Armenia closely cooperated with the ODIHR and Venice Commission to produce appropriate law governing peaceful assembly. But it is one thing to have good laws, and the other thing is to apply them efficiently on the ground, given to the reality of different situations that may arise during demonstrations and rallies. Apparently, not every situation can be prescribed by legislation and even regulations, and thus training of police is essential. In recent years, Armenia undertook important police reforms with close cooperation with the OSCE and its Yerevan office. The demonstrations and rallies occurred in Armenia in June and July in connection with protests against the rise of utility tariffs have been important tests for assessing efficiency of police reforms. In our view, in spite of certain shortcomings, the police overall performed well in extremely challenging environment. Closing Central Avenue and camping next door to the governmental buildings for weeks constitute challenging environment for every OSCE participating states. Under these circumstances, the police managed and created conditions for continued peaceful assembly after 24 June clashes. Also, I would like to add that all detained people were freed overnight, and compensation was offered and given to the damaged properties of the journalists. The improved performance of the police was widely recognized in the OSCE. When it comes to freedom of association, we are witnessing emergence of strong and vibrant civic movements in different fields in Armenia. Armenia does not impose any restrictions on the activities of NGOs, and we are more than happy to see Armenian NGOs here, regardless we agree or disagree with their all assessments. Finally, I would like to reiterate the point made in my opening remarks. My delegation would not engage in dialogue with organizations which are created to occupy the place of jailed civil society. We really regret that as a result of human rights crackdown in Azerbaijan, persons who eulogized ruling dynasty in previous regime became so-called human rights defenders, and persons who committed assassinations are presented as human rights activists. In the meantime, I would like to reiterate that my delegation is open to engage in dialogue with official Azerbaijani delegation. Thank you.
Thank you. The delegation of Azerbaijan will be followed by the Helsinki Citizens' Assembly of Vanadzor.
Thank you very much. Protection of fundamental rights and freedoms and guaranteeing the rule of law benefit of its nationals is the priority task of the government.
International organizations confirm that the law on peaceful assembly appropriates to modern European standards. In 2008, after amendments on the law coordinated with Council of Europe Venice Commission, that the Commission highly appreciated and called positive changes. Secretary of Venice Commission of COE, Venice Commission considers satisfactory law on freedom on peaceful assembly. OSCE Baku office declared that in the preparation of the law, they were taking into account proposals of OSCE and term of peaceful assembly. I would like to talk about very shortly about legislation on NGO, which is made amendment. I have heard many comments about this, so I would like to add some comments on this. The accepted laws are in the frame of commitment that Azerbaijan made under international organizations. Azerbaijan was based on experience of leading countries such as Germany, UK, and other countries of Europe. I would like to mention that there was held discussion with experts working on human rights, democracy, and other fields, chairs of organizations, as well as the Parliament and Ministry of Justice concerning changes in NGO legislation of Azerbaijan. In general, changes on NGO legislation provides NGOs to be transparent and responsible towards their work. For example, NGOs hold neither annual meeting nor report activity. Law demands to do it open and transparent. Amendment on legislation addressed to increase quantity the mechanism. Another issue. How non-registered NGOs could be financed? They have no bank account. Then how does money transfer? Where are their reports? How does NGO finance if it has not any grant agreement with donor? Therefore, amendments on NGO legislation serve to enhance transparent activity of NGOs, social control, accountability, increasing of responsibility and efficiency. I would like to also add some comments to the speech of Mr. Forst. Azerbaijan is firm on the road to building a law-abiding society. One of the basic principles of the rule of law is that people from all walks of the life are equal before the law. There is no difference between the citizens committing an offense, regardless even if they proclaim themselves human rights defenders or not. Human rights have nothing to do with themselves or providing an indulgence to engage in illegal activities. Only individuals having committed concrete criminal acts are brought before justice, and all cases are considered in an objective and impartial manner in full compliance with the national legislation, including international commitments of Azerbaijan. I will use my right of reply in order to continue. Thank you.
Thank you. I will now ask Helsinki Citizens Assembly of Vanadzor, followed by the delegation of Kyrgyzstan.
Спасибо.
Thank you. My name is Artur Sapons. I'm with the Helsinki Citizens Assembly in Armenia. Dear participants, in Armenia we find ourselves in a very interesting situation at the present time, namely this process of changes in the constitution. In the post-Soviet states, there's this very interesting rule that seems to be followed after the decomposition of the Soviet Union and these historic changes in the regimes. The new people coming to power rather like to hang on to it. And so changes in government have become an institutionalized problem. And I think that that is a major challenge for us to meet if the obligations that have been officially taken on board by governments through their membership in international organizations, and in particular the OSCE. I mean, some of them just change places, like Putin, Medvedev, Putin. In some of them, power is handed from father to son. But in Armenia, they came up with a new idea. There are to be parliamentary elections, then presidential elections in 17 and 18. But now the constitution is being changed with a view to moving to a more parliamentary democracy. At first blush, that might seem very nice and rosy. But in fact, the basic way of changing the situation is through presidential elections. And now those in power, in order to stay in power, they want to change the presidential elections and end up with an absolute majority in parliament. Furthermore, in the draft changes to the constitution, there is a limitation of certain rights on the basis of the interests of a democratic state. Well, in the Soviet constitution, in the first article, it said that it's a country with a rule of law, it's a democratic state, but of course the mechanisms required to guarantee this were completely absent. And there is this attempt now to put into our constitution that would end up in a sort of a declarative approach to the protection of human rights. And this is of grave concern to Armenian civil society. We consider that the Armenian authorities and the national institutions should pay closer attention to the possibilities opened by the Eurasian Union, and we are not in a position really to inform Armenian citizens about what is behind these proposed changes to the constitution. Thank you.
Kyrgyzstan, followed by the Human Rights Center Legal Aid Society. Kyrgyzstan, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like briefly to speak to the issue of freedom of association and also NHRIs in Kyrgyzstan. Now, we all know that the right to freedom of association is one of the fundamental rights guaranteed in international documents about human rights. In Kyrgyzstan, the constitution adopted in 2000 really set up new standards when it comes to human rights, including the right of freedom of association. And the standards in the new constitution also seek to put in place new mechanisms to ensure that human rights are protected. Now, according to the Venice Commission, these texts that we have enacted are very well drafted. And we also have a law on freedom of association which regulates the relations between citizens and the powers that be, with a right for every citizen to associate, to have this freedom of association, but also foreigners living in Kyrgyzstan. Now, in drafting this law, we took into consideration opinions expressed by international experts, by human rights groups, by the OSCE, and also the lawyers of the Republic. The human rights defense organizations of Kyrgyzstan, including the National Fund for the Support of Democracy, together with the OSCE office in Bishkek, they are monitoring the extent to which the freedom of association is guaranteed. There's an annual report published on this. Now, of course, for the socioeconomic development of the country, freedom of association is important. And in November of last year, we had a report that showed that over the previous year there had been 387 peaceful demonstrations and public meetings. There is also a law about the forces of law and order in the Republic, in accordance with which members of those forces must deal with any demonstrators in a respectful manner, and there are no restrictions imposed. There is a right, therefore, to hold public meetings based on an appropriate mechanism with permits issues. And in conclusion, I'd just like to mention that at the present time, Kyrgyzstan is a member of dozens of regional and international organizations with various commitments that have been taken on board to ensure that human rights are protected. Thank you for your attention.
Human Rights Center Legal Aid Society will be followed by Newsmaker MD.
Oleg Volchik, Human Rights Center, Belarus. As we've heard, the challenges for human rights activists have been spoken about. First of all, I'd point out that human rights actors are a mirror of society, or a thermometer reflecting the situation on human rights in a country. We prepare reports monitoring as to how the government fulfills its OSCE obligations. And we have competent people working on this. We recall the obligation of the state to respond to violations. Recently, human rights activists in Belarus have had trust pushed in them by electors. Now we have to register with the prosecutor's office. We're the only people who can provide comments or help people, citizens, with their complaints. Regarding human rights activists, my organization and others since 2003 have been dismantled by the courts. We registered our office in Ukraine, in Poland, and in Lithuania. Despite the fact that the Human Rights Committee examined our complaint, the state was meant to reinstate our rights. I recall that if I'm not registered, then there is a criminal code offence and we can be charged. Since 2003, we're unable to hold meetings, pickets, nor are we able to give out human rights material. We do this, but we do this through underground literature. And we're not able to do this as a normal lawyer, for example. There is a very poor trend here, which is detention of people. For example, people get together, hold a rock festival in the countryside. They're detained, charged. For example, we have nudists, for example, who are just enjoying the sun, and they're arrested as well. We have administrative courts, and we're charging people. Use of expletives, for example, becomes a charge. And it will be interesting to see how this is pursued. What are our recommendations? First, what I would ask is that we should restore the OSCE office in Minsk to enable the special rapporteur of the UN on Belarus to go to Belarus, and third, that there should be dialogue with the human rights organizations in Belarus. Thank you very much.
D will be followed by Article 19.
Yes, thank you. Hello to everyone. My name is Marina Shupak. I'm a human rights journalist from Moldovan online media Newsmaker MD. I would like to raise awareness on the way right to peaceful assembly is realized or is not realized in Moldova. You decide. Electric Yerevan protest was mentioned a lot during the day. But has someone of you heard about Moldovan alternative of this protest, which was called City of Liberty? I guess no. But Moldovans also protested against electricity prices. But unfortunately, the protest did not last a lot because Moldovan court prohibited the protest in August this year, and activists were forced to take their tents off. Mr. Ombudsman remind us about mass protests which are held right now in the city center of Chisinau. But I would like to press your attention on the mass protest organized also at 6th of September this year near General Prosecutor's office, where a group of a few hundred of people protested. As a result, 6 activists are now in the Moldovan prison. They are accused and they are in the risk to get 8 years of imprisonment. They are accused in making attempts to attack General Prosecutor office. In this group of people is also former member of Moldovan Parliament and former PASE member, Mr. Grigori Petrenko. There are several YouTube videos from the protest where you can see that this protest was fully peaceful. Unfortunately, there is no reaction from national human rights institutions and NGOs within Moldova. One of the very few reactions within Moldova is from Minister of Internal Affairs of our country, who right next day after activists were arrested, honored 5 policemen with diplomas for their courage. For the courage they had when so-called stopped protesters to enter General Prosecutor office. Thank you for your attention. I would like to raise your awareness and urge you to have courage to investigate this case and to tell your opinion because unfortunately we have no reactions over these events within the country. Thank you.
Thank you. Article 19 will now take the floor, followed by the Kazakh Community Association.
Thanks very much, and I'll keep my comments really short. I really just wanted to point to an opportunity to try and close the implementation gap between what's written in the OSCE guidelines on protecting peaceful association, a peaceful assembly, and the reality of what's clearly happening across the OSCE region in many states, as we've heard today. In March 2014, the UN Human Rights Council adopted a resolution 2538, which requested the relevant special procedures to prepare guidelines for facilitating and protecting peaceful assemblies. And that should be based on good practices and also consultation with civil society and other stakeholders. And if those are comprehensive, they can be used to create another international instrument to put greater pressure on states to do this. With regard to that, Article 19 has developed a series of principles on what the right to protest looks like, both around protection of freedom of assembly, but also around the other rights engaged during protest. We'd really request anyone who's interested to contribute that. But also my second recommendation is that we coordinate efforts on this. The OSCE has a great document in place, and it doesn't make sense to reproduce it. And so it's really important that as civil society and other stakeholders, we coordinate our efforts at the UN to make sure that there's more ways to ensure states are observing their obligations on this. Thank you.
Thank you. I will now give the floor to the Kazakh Community Association, followed by the Educational Human Rights House, who will be our last speaker. The Kazakh Community Association, please.
Thank you very much. I would like to state that NGOs in Kazakhstan really fall into 2 groups. There are those who are funded by the Kazakh authorities or by various entities of the administration or associated with the administration. And then there are those that are funded by oligarchs who live abroad or who happen to be in prison, for instance, in France. But there is a small group of genuinely independent NGOs that really represent the interests of the people of Kazakhstan. But there are very few of them, and they are subject to pressure, both from the side of the authorities and by others as well. So my appeal to you would be to hold out a hand and to support those small NGOs that really represent the interests of the people. I mean, they can't come here to speak to you because they can't afford to buy a plane ticket, not to mention pay for a hotel room. And in situ, I mean, in the field, Western organizations don't seem to be interested at all in these groups. Not only do they not support them financially, they don't even support them morally. When they do come to Kazakhstan, they meet with the officially funded NGOs. There's been mention of Kozlov already, who's imprisoned, but we also have another national hero, Arona Tabieg, about whom in the West, here at the OSCE, very little is said. I mean, people come and talked about the Ablazov cases, the Kozlov cases, and this is surprising not just for me, but also for the people in the street of Kazakhstan. I mean, why is there no reference to the real heroes, Jaron Atableka? I mean, he wasn't even provided with a bed and linen, not to mention a lack of health care. I mean, he's been in prison for 8 years, and for 4 of them, he was in isolation. He had no contact with anyone. And his family members, his wife, his daughter, they haven't seen him at all in 8 years. I mean, that's a sort of a run-of-the-mill political prisoner in Kazakhstan. And the authorities of Kazakhstan put huge pressure on these independent NGOs by sending representatives of their NGOs who break up demonstrations of peace-loving citizens. And just one more point. We, in Kazakhstan, the people of Kazakhstan would like to have NGOs like in Western Europe. I mean, here in Poland, for instance, there were NGOs that put forward candidates for the presidential elections, for the parliamentary elections in Poland. And someday we in Kazakhstan, we hope to have the same. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. The Educational Human Rights House has the last word.
Thank you. I will not have a jacket today, but I will have a flag. Human Rights House in Ukraine and simultaneously the Vilnius University. I am an expert on advocacy, and we talked about the advocacy a lot today. So, political freedoms and civil liberties in Ukraine are on the rise. We got a ranking of 3 in terms of political freedoms and of 3 in terms of civil liberties, as it was determined in the Freedom of the World, in the World Report. Many of the civil society representatives, independent journalists, leaders of NGOs became members of the parliament because they believe that changes are possible, maybe first time in the decade. And large percent of our population believe that the efforts of civil society will mean a lot. They believe in social activism and in the strong leader. In the recent Forum of 2000, well-known former political prisoner from Belarus, Ales Beliatsky, who many of you may know, stated that, quote, "The future of Belarus will depend on whether Ukraine becomes a free state," unquote. So we refer to the international community to support consolidated efforts of civil society in Ukraine, of the government and the leader of Ukraine, and to support the European way of our country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would love to ask our introducers for comments, but I can see the watch and it tells me that we have very little time and still 10 rights to reply. So I'll ask now the delegation of Kyrgyzstan to exercise its right to reply, followed by the delegation of Hungary. Kyrgyzstan, please. You have 1 minute.
Thank you very much. We'd like to exercise our right to reply to correct what we've heard during this session. First of all, regarding Askarov, on the 20th of December, Anjuman Askarov was charged. His guilt has been established. He's charged for taking part in criminal organizations with killing a policeman whose body was burnt after he was murdered. And there were many questions about him, about the person who was charged from international organizations. And in response to these requests, the Kyrgyz government undertook an inquiry on the process. We invited international experts. As a result of this, there was no substance for re-examining his case. The second question on LGBT, I'd like to point out that Kyrgyzstan, we do not have any legislation against LGBTs in Afghanistan. Any form of discrimination, including sexual discrimination, is prohibited. Everybody is able to exercise their freedom of expression, freedom of association, as in any other civilized state. We do not forbid homosexual sexual preference, any act of violence, whether or not this concerns LGBT, requires a response from the authorities. The LGBT statement, the law that was referred to in the LGBT statement, is not a law, it is a bill. Please conclude. Please conclude. I'd like to emphasize that the statement is unfounded. Thank you.
Delegation of Hungary, followed by the delegation of Ukraine. Please, 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. We fully align also with the statement of the EU, but let me make some remarks as an answer to the statement delivered by the distinguished US delegation. First of all, there is no applicable general regulation with the aim to criminalize or restrict the civil society. From the beginning of 2011, the government expressed concerns about the distribution mechanism of the Norwegian fund. In different levels and forums, the government asked its partner to examine functioning of the Hungarian concern responsible for the distribution. After the request remained without answer, in 2014, the minister heading the Prime Minister's office asked an examination from the agency responsible for the supervising of the distribution of public money. The procedure discovered some abuses. Some of them could be a basis for criminal investigation. This procedure is still ongoing. The Hungarian government believes that the development of Hungary cannot imagine without the contribution of civil society. After a conference organized by the ODIHR in Budapest last November, for which we are thankful, the government decided to initiate regular meetings with the civil society, provide an opportunity to speak about problems from both sides. The last meeting held in this May. Thank you, Madam Moderator.
The delegation of Ukraine, followed by Greece, and thank you very much for keeping to the time limit.
Thank you, Ms. Moderator. In reply to the statement made by the NGO representatives, which clearly queuing after the Russian propaganda, we would like to reject the allegations as false and groundless. It should be noted that the record of implementation of the package of national remembrance legislation, as we call it, has proved that the provision of these laws do not and cannot pose any threat of tensions. The set of laws is based on the numerous international documents condemning the crimes and the legacy of the Nazi and communist regimes, strongly emphasize the determination of Ukraine to condemn any manifestation of fascism and totalitarianism and to prevent the spread of the ideas of intolerance and radicalism. We underline that the provisions also provide for openness of the archives and aim to ensure the right of everyone in a democratic society to receive objective information on historical facts. In view of the attention to the situation in and around Ukraine demonstrated by those representatives, we would like also to draw the attention to the fact that the demonstrations to protest against the Russian aggression against Ukraine or express disapproval of the ever largest ultra-nationalist meeting in St. Petersburg with approval of the Russian authorities, or the fact that the that investigated Russian aggression against Ukraine and the deaths of Russian soldiers in Donbass faced particular pressure from the Russian authorities. Thank you.
Thank you. Delegation of Greece, followed by the delegation of France. Greece, please.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Since my country was mentioned by an NGO from Western Thrace in Greece, I would like to exercise my right of reply. The Greek constitution unequivocally protects the freedom of association of all the citizens of the state. A large number of Muslim minority associations and NGOs are registered with the competent authorities and operate freely in Thrace. 3 minority associations from Thrace that have not officially registered filed a petition before the European Court of Human Rights against the Greek state. The judgments of the court were in favor of the plaintiff associations. The Greek state respects the court's decision and works to adopt the appropriate measures to comply to them, including amendments to the law. It should be stressed, however, that the previously mentioned, not officially recognized 3 associations do engage in numerous activities without any impediment. Thank you.
Thank you. The delegation of France followed by the delegation of Uzbekistan. France, please.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. In response to the Russian Federation that has drawn a parallel between the law on foreign agents and the legislation in France, let me stress the fact that freedom of association is not subject to a permit. Any citizen has the right freely to associate without any prior permit or declaration, and there is no specific control of associations that receive funds from abroad, and administrative finding of associations is something that occurs exceptionally. This really covers extreme right-wing groups that call for racial hatred or that are armed groups. In 2013, a group was dissolved because it had caused the death of a teenager. And any citizen who feels that his or her freedom of association has not been respected has the right to appeal before a judge and to be heard and given a fair trial.
Followed by Turkey, Uzbekistan, please.
Thank you, Moderator. We also would like to exercise our right of reply to the US delegation and the European Union. Uzbekistan has set up all the required conditions for non-NGOs. We have over 200 laws, regulations governing NGOs. We have a host of measures. We have a parliamentary commission. We have a special fund and that deals with these matters, providing help to subsidizing with significant amounts of money the NGOs. NGOs are covered by a presidential decree on civil society. According to the decree, there is the tax for registering has been reduced. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The delegation of Turkey, followed by the delegation of the United Kingdom. Turkey, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I'd like to exercise our right of reply to the statement by the Netherlands in which Turkey was also mentioned. At the outset, let me stress that the rights to freedom of peaceful assembly and association are fundamental rights in any democratic society, and as such, they are safeguarded by the Turkish Constitution. Recently, in March 2014, legislation was enacted which further expands the scope of these fundamental freedoms in my country. Notably, the law on assembly and demonstration marches was amended, ensuring that authorities consult stakeholders before making decisions on rallies and demonstrations, extending the allowed duration for rallies, and giving the authority for monitoring and, if necessary, terminating demonstrations to a body which includes representatives of demonstrators. In addition, in June 2013, our Ministry of Interior published circulars regulating the use of force by law enforcement officers. Of course, we must always bear in mind that the right to freedom of assembly is not absolute. International human rights law foresees that people should not resort to violence while exercising their freedoms. It's therefore important to distinguish between peaceful and violent demonstrators. And finally, with respect to the remarks of a civil society representative, I wish to emphasize that the justified measures Turkey is taking in the face of the current direct and imminent terrorist threat to its security and stability are fully in line with its international obligations. Thank you.
Thank you. The delegation of the United Kingdom, followed by the delegation of the United States of America. UK, you have the floor.
Thank you for allowing me this right of reply in my national capacity now. I would like to underline that the UK takes the fundamental rights of peaceful assembly and freedom of association extremely seriously. Dear colleagues, it's not clear to me exactly what the Russian Federation means when referring to groups undermining the territory or form of government in several EU member states, but perhaps I can clarify the situation in the UK. The UK has legislation that does ban a number of named terrorist organisations that pose a direct threat to the UK. This list is subject to stringent legal and parliamentary process and oversight. But more generally, individuals and groups are free to express their views on our country and our government. That is a fundamental pillar of our democratic society. Colleagues, there is a world of difference between the actions of a democratic, accountable government to protect its people on the one hand, and on the other, far-reaching attacks on fundamental rights such as peaceful assembly and freedom of association, which are designed to stifle freedom of expression and genuine civil society. That difference lies at the heart of our debate today. Thank you.
Thank you. The delegation of the United States of America, followed by the delegation of Azerbaijan in the US.
Thank you. With respect to comments made by the Russian delegation on the U.S. Foreign Agent Registration Act, or FARA, I'd like to note that simply because FARA and the Russian legislation share similar names in no way means that they hold the same content. Russia has often tried to cloak actions inconsistent with international human rights obligations and commitments in familiar language, but no one should fall for these false equivalences. I would like to reiterate two factual points about FARA's operation that we in the United States have raised before. First, FARA does not require registration by an organization just because the organization receives foreign funding. Instead, FARA ties the designation of a, quote, foreign agent to work on behalf of, not simply financed or supported by, a foreign principal. Second, FARA is not directed at NGOs. It applies to any person and is most often applied to attorneys, public relation firms, and lobbying firms, not NGOs. By way of one concrete example, there are many U.S. organizations that receive EU funds for advocacy in the United States. FARA would not apply to these organizations, despite the fact that they are actively engaged in public policy conversations on the most sensitive of issues, many of which the US and the EU do not always agree. Thank you.
Thank you. The delegation of Azerbaijan, followed by the delegation of Moldova. Azerbaijan, you have the floor.
Thank you. Actually, it's my third day here, and I heard many statements from the foreign NGOs, as well as the United States of America, and now from the Mr. Forst. It's odd that I repeatedly made clear statement on mentioned case, but the statement is going on. Yesterday and the day before yesterday, I made the clear statement about the persons that was mentioned that is arrested by the Kurd, but again the same paper is reading, the same things are doing, and I can't understand that it seems that we did not gather together in order to make dialogue. On the contrary, we don't listen each other. It's my first thing. Another thing, it's odd that there are three South Caucasian countries in our near neighborhood. In Armenia, just a few days ago, Vahan Martyan, head of the Armenian NGO, asked for a political asylum, and Mr. Forst didn't mention it. I didn't understand this. And also, over the 230 people got arrested as a result of violent crackdown in Armenia. Also, I didn't heard. Even Radio Liberty's Armenian office was, let's say, the head of the arrested, but there isn't any word about it. About the, it's really regretful that Armenia, instead of the providing rights of the mentioned civilians who went to occupy territories in order to visit...
Excuse me, I will have to ask you to come to conclusion.
Yes, I'm going to conclusion. The mentioned civilians who went to occupied territories in order to visit the graves of their parents tries somehow to justify the illegal acts of Armenian forces. Those people are two of about 1 million Azerbaijans who were expelled from their territories. They had suffered enough. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Moldova, followed by the delegation of Armenia. Moldova, you have the floor.
Thank you for giving me the floor. I would like to precise some information from our part about the public actions organized by former deputy from the parliament. The government of the Republic of Moldova reaffirms its unwavering commitment to freedom of peaceful assembly and to freedom of association as fundamental components of a democratic society, guaranteeing to all citizens of the country the right to protest by holding meetings and demonstrations. At the same time, in agreement with the laws in force, the participants must act peacefully and without violence or threat of violence. In accordance with the Article 11 of the European Convention of Human Rights, the exercise of this freedom, since it carries with its duty and responsibility, may be subject to such formalities, conditions, restrictions, or penalties as are prescribed by law and are necessary in a democratic society in the interest of national security. Finally, I would like to reassure you that the Republic of Moldova will continue to be attached to its international commitments, including those related to the freedom of association, and to pay utmost attention to the principles characterizing a democratic society. Thank you.
Thank you. And then the delegation of Armenia as our
Thank
last.
you, Madam Moderator. I would like to briefly respond to the accusations made by Azerbaijani delegation. First, when Azerbaijani delegation refers to 238 arrested people with regard to the demonstration in Armenia, she or Azerbaijani delegation should know that they were not arrested, they were detained, and they were freed in a couple of hours. This is a usual procedure when there is demonstrations, and it cannot be equal to gross human rights violations that we see in Azerbaijan. Second point, Azerbaijani delegation referred to the subversive criminal groups which perpetrated killings in Nagorno-Karabakh. And this group, they killed out of their so-called peaceful activities, 2 persons were killed and 1 person was wounded. Among victims, 1 was teenager, another 1 was woman. And if killing Armenians is not criminal offense in Azerbaijan, it is criminal offense in Nagorno-Karabakh. And the fact that they made killings was implicitly recognized by Azerbaijani president, who compared them with Safarov, Ramil Safarov, by saying that we will take them out as we took out Ramil Safarov. Excuse me, this will not be the case. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I realize it is late, so I would like, before doing anything else, thank our interpreters for staying with us for this long session, and thank you very much to our introducers and to all the audience for a very intensive exchange of opinions. I would like to ask you kindly to remember to leave your headsets, but I have one announcement to make that might affect your travels tomorrow. We have just been told that the taxi drivers in Warsaw tomorrow will be protesting by way of driving at the speed of 30 kilometers per hour all day. That means that if you need to get to the airport, you need to plan much longer than it would usually take. So just to keep this into, take this into consideration. Please enjoy the side events, of which the list is outside on the information board. And we will see you in the afternoon session at 3. Thank you very much.